Testing, testing, 1, 2. Hi, Julie. Hi, Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. We have a quorum of the Planning Committee in the room, and we'll get this meeting, if I can call the committee to order, we'll get this meeting going. Well, welcome to the Council Chamber, this intimate venue for Planning Committee. We are usually in the Champlain room, but unfortunately today we've been bumped by the big city mayors. So the big city mayors will be meeting in the Champlain room. I tried to negotiate a Rob Ford bobblehead for us all in payment for moving, but I was told no. Members of committee, welcome to the 70th meeting of the Planning Committee for February 25th. If anyone in the audience has wishes to speak to any of the items that are on today's agenda, if they'd fill in a request to speak form located at the table outside the council chamber and bring it to the committee assistant to my closest right, we'll make sure you get on the agenda to speak to the committee. If you don't want to speak to the committee, but you would like your comments to form part of the public record, there is a comment sheet that is at the table, and if you fill it in and submit those comments, we will ensure that those comments form part of the public record and will preserve your or any appeal rights that may come with those comments. So, this is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed as items 3 to 12 on today's agenda. For the items listed above, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the Ontario Municipal Board. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the Ontario Municipal Board if Council does not adopt an amendment within 120 days of receipt of an application for zoning and 180 days for an official plan amendment. Now, a comment sheet is available at the door, as I said, for those who wish to submit written comments. Une fouille de commentaires est disponible à l'entrée pour toute personne désirante soumettre des commentaires écrits concernant les modifications. So, members of committee, we're going to see if we can go through a consent agenda. Are there any declarations of interest from members of committee? Okay. Members of committee minutes, 69, Tuesday, February 11th. Are those carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 1 is the designation of 478 Albert Street. It's a designation under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. I have one person registered to speak to this item in agreement with the recommendation. Mr. Lahi. Mr. Lahi, you're here. I know I saw you. So you're not on Albert, you're on Sparks. Okay, well, so we'll put you as item number 2 then. Item number 2, okay. So now that Mr. Lahi's not speaking to item number 1, we have no one registered to speak to the committee with respect to item number 1. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to item number 1, the designation of 478 Albert Street? Okay, members of committee, is this item carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 2 is an application to alter 106 to 116 Spark Street, 111 to 113 Queen Street, located in the Spark Street Heritage Conservation District and designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. We have 2 people registered to speak, both in agreement with the application. Mr. Lahi and Ms. Leboldus. Is that correct? I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names, pronouncing names. And Les Gagne with Spark Street Authority and the BIA. So, Mr. Lahi, you're in agreement. You don't need to speak to the committee if we're prepared to carry this item? Okay. Mr. Gagne, I'm assuming you're in agreement if you're here? And do you need to speak to the committee if we're prepared to carry the recommendation? So you're going to have to speak.
Yes, he wants to.
Oh, you'd like to speak for a couple minutes. Okay, we'll hold that item. No. We're going to go through an agenda, and then we're going to have to come back to that. Ms. Leboldas, if that's correct, are you here? Yeah, and would you like to speak to the committee? Okay. Item number 3, Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw, Anomalies and Minor Corrections, First Report 2014. I have no one registered to speak to the committee with respect to item number 3. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to item number 3? Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw 205-250, Anomalies and Minor Corrections. Oh. Okay, members of committee, is this item carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 4 is an official plan amendment for 4401 Fallowfield Road. I have no one registered to speak to the committee with respect to item number 4, official plan amendment 4401 Fallowfield Road. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to item number 4, 4401 Fallowfield Road? No? Okay. Members of committee, is this item carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 5 is the zoning at 5385, 5395, and part of 5431 Fernbank Road. I have one person registered to speak to the committee, well, I guess 2 people really, Mr. Weiss and Mr. Pierce, both in agreement. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to item number 5, the zoning at 5385, 5395, and part of 5431 Fernbank Road? Now, Mr. Weiss and Mr. Pierce, you're in agreement with the staff recommendation. You don't need to, do you need to speak to the committee if we're prepared to carry this recommendation? Okay. Thank you very much. Members of committee, is item number 5 carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 6 is zoning, part of 5611 Fernbank Road. I have one person registered to speak to the committee with respect to this item, Eric Bays from Novatech Engineering, and he is in agreement. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to 5611 Fernbank Road? No. Okay. Mr. Bays, do you need to speak to committee if we're prepared to carry this item? Okay. Thank you. Members of committee, is item number 6, zoning part of 5611 Fernbank Road, carried? Carried? Okay. Item number 7 is the item number 7 is zoning at 2 Iber Road, 5734 and 5754 Hazeldean Road. I have one person registered to speak to that item, Mr. McElligott, in support of the application. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes, in addition to Mr. McElligott, to speak to the item of the zoning at 2 Iber Road, 5734 and 5754 Hazeldean Road? Mr. McElligott, you're in support of the application. Do you need to speak to the committee if we're prepared to carry this item? Okay, excellent. Members of committee, is the item number 7, 2 Iber Road, zoning 5734 and 5754 Hazeldean Road, carried? Carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 8 is the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment 261, 265, 271, 275, and 281 Laurier Avenue East. We have people in agreement and in opposition, so we're going to hold that item and come back to it. Item number 8. Item number 9 is the zoning at 800 Montreal Road. I have one person registered to speak to this item, Mr. Fernie from FOTEN. I'm assuming you're representing the applicant. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to the zoning at 800 Montreal Road? No. Now, Mr. Fernie, you're in agreement with the application? And you don't need to speak to the committee as long as we're prepared to carry this item? Okay. Perfect. So on, members of committee, on item number 9, zoning at 800 Montreal Road, is the item carried? Carried? Okay. Item number 10 is the item number 10 is the zone official plan and zoning 514, 516, 518, 530, and 532 Rochester Street. We have 2 people registered to speak to the committee with respect to that item. Mr. Tremblay, well, 3 people, I guess. Mr. Tremblay, Mr. Cohen, and Mr. Hoban, representing Foten, Solways, and Hoban Architects. I'm assuming you're for the applicant, so. And we do have a motion that deals with some of the section, a minor amendment to the Section 37 benefits, and I'm looking, Councillor, do you need to speak to this item?
I'd like to speak to it, Mr. Chair. A couple of comments, but Michael Powell was coming to speak as well.
Sorry, you're right. Is Mr. Powell in the audience?
I don't think he's here yet, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Well, let me go through the consent agenda, and then we'll try to get, we may come back to you for your comments and the motion to, if we can move on that relatively quickly. So, okay, so we'll move on to, we'll hold that item and move on to it. Item number 11 is a zoning bylaw amendment, 364 Churchill Avenue and 348 Whitby Avenue. Is, I have no one, I do have one, sorry. I have, Bill Holtzman is here to speak to the item, and he's in agreement, and that, I'm assuming, is if the item is held. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to the committee with respect to item number 11, the zoning at 364 Churchill Avenue and 348 Whitby Avenue? No? Mr. Holtzman, you don't need to speak to the committee if we're prepared to carry this item? Perfect. Members of committee, is item number 11 carried? Carried. Okay. Item number 12 is a zoning bylaw amendment, 1040 Somerset Street West. I have 2 people registered to speak to this item, Ms. Grahuta, Mr. Mahatra, and Mr. Cleaves from the Architects Alliance, and they're for the applicant, and Barbara Long. Now, Ms. Long, are you here? And are you in support or in opposition to the application? Okay, so you want to speak to the committee, I'm assuming. Okie doke. Okay, so we'll hold item 12 and come back to it. Item, so let's go back to item number 2. Item number 2 is an application to alter 106 to 116 Spark Street, 111 to 113 Queen Street, located in the Spark Street Heritage Conservation District. So, members of committee, we're going to hear from Mr. Lahi and, well, I mean, I'm going to call him and allow him to speak. If he wants to just answer questions, that's fine. And, sorry, I'm getting my, and Mr. Gagne. So, why don't, Mr. Gagne, if you'd like to come up down here to, yep. You got to press the, got it, there you go.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Les Gagne, Executive Director for Spark Street Authority and Business Improvement District. Thanks for the opportunity. For 20 years, Spark Street has been in limbo without direction or real commitment from its partners to create a viable and dynamic business community, premier tourist destination in Canada's capital. We now have a thriving festival scene on Spark Street, which now hosts 3 of the biggest festivals in Ottawa and are the biggest rib fests in the country. Our recent entry, Poutine Fest, has attracted over 50,000 people first time out. Now that we're creating some buzz on Spark Street, we would like to ask the City of Ottawa and the Ashcroft Group for their support and consideration during the construction process of the new RE Centre as we move forward. Spark Street has seen its share of disruptions, losses, setbacks, with many of the buildings from Elgin to Lyon currently under some kind of redevelopment, renovation, restoration, or complete rebuild. Many lives and families and businesses depend on a vibrant and inviting Spark Street community. I ask for your respect during this work to work with me and the Spark Street Authority as we venture forward with a new project with the least amount of disruptions and negative impact. It's been said for decades, Uptown Ottawa needs more residential and more people gathering spaces. And with the proposed RE Centre, this new development is crucial to achieving this objective. However, for approximately 5+ years, the project has been stalled for various reasons, and Spark Street and our merchant community has been paying the price. We are home to many buildings that are currently being underutilized. 90 Wellington, former Tourist Information Center, completely empty. We've got many of our buildings that are under construction and are causing havoc on our street and a major disruption to our businesses. We all know that the current state of the building and the hoarding is a disgrace, and not the first impression we want our visitors and tourists to have when coming to the capital. Not to mention the negative impact this neglect by the NCC has had on our ability to attract people, investors, retain and attract new businesses to our community. We're working hard to make Spark Street better, and we're very excited to have the support of people like you and many of the others who want Spark Street to be the pulse of the capital and an awesome alternative to the Byward Market. I encourage your support to support this proposal and do what is necessary to bring this project to life. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from members of the committee? Well, we've got other speakers. So, Ms. Leboldis, if you'd like to come up to the table.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Michelle Leboldis, the great-granddaughter of Benjamin Stapleton, who began the Centre Theatre on Spark Street and also had another theatre, the Majestic, further down on Spark Street. As I mentioned last August at the subcommittee meeting, I lamented the loss of many of the heritage buildings on the south side of Spark Street specifically. Since it is a conservation district, I always believed this guaranteed security from neglect or destruction. At first glance, I was upset that the Centre Theatre building would come down and the past would be erased. I wanted to make sure the story would be told. Since then, I've done a first pass through all the boxes of documents we donated to Library and Archives Canada in 1973 when my grandfather died and the Centre Theatre was sold. I was stunned to find in the last box, in the last file, and it is exactly the way it happened, in the last envelope, the architect's plans for my grandfather's other theatre, the Westboro on Richmond Road in Nepean. Built in 1941, it was designed by the renowned Ottawa architect Ernst Noffke in a beautiful Art Deco style. There is confusion, however, over who the architect was for the Centre Theatre, as the Noffke files do not include the Spark Street address as his work, and it is proving difficult to find any other possibility. I wish to pass on information I have discovered, though. In my personal papers, I have a letter which is a conundrum, and the letter looks like this. Dated February 1911, it tells my great-grandfather, Ben Stapleton, that the Centre Theatre can be built on Queen Street with the entrance on Spark Street where 3 stores were. The stunning part is that the writer states, quote, "We agree to build you the theatre, and the rent for the whole shall be $6,000 per annum paid monthly," end of quote. Deciphering the signature on the Senate of Canada letterhead reveals it to be Jean Saint-Denis Lemoine, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Senate in 1911. As you can appreciate, I really did believe the federal government then controlled the property's heritage designation. Finding the architect for the theatre, still unknown, then led me to believe it might be a government-contracted architect, which led me to the Department of Public Works files at Library Archives Canada. However, the finding aid for this phone is upfront in stating that a chill will go up the spine of a researcher attempting to locate anything in this humongous archive. A challenge then in completing my task of telling this family story of a very beautiful theatre. Once the story is fully researched, I will provide a copy to the for the department's information. By the way, the planning committee or the planning department is lucky to have an excellent history of Ottawa theatres written by Alain Migueles at a theatre near you. It was a wonderful experience to provide information on this centre theatre during his research, and he happens to work in your planning department. While I have the privilege to question what's happened, it is also my responsibility to provide something positive going forward. It is laudable that the committee is requiring windows and other elements to be used in the new build so that the original intent is retained. I'm very pleased that the historic portion of the building will feature a restored cornice with decorative pediment, and the 3 large window openings will feature the restored oriel windows with rectangular windows above. I can tell you from my grandfather's office above that street entrance towards Parliament Hill, the view was magnificent. Whatever the outcome, I would like to suggest that while this 19th century property is now a 21st century story, could a bronze plaque be placed on Spark Street to provide the 20th century history of this theatre? While there are no commemorations for other former area theatres, at least that I can find, at least we can do justice to one of them. I would like to help in this commemoration if it comes to pass. Thank you for your efforts on this. It is appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there questions from members of the committee? No. Mr. Lai, would you like to come up and say you'll put a plaque up? Maybe help us out here? No, obviously not. Not to put you on the spot, but, you know. Okay, do you want it? Okay, Mr. Lahi's just here to answer any specific questions. Are there questions from members of committee? No. Councillor? No. Mr. Lahi, thank you very much. And do pass along that the request from Ms. Laboldis. Councillor Holmes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The Spark Street Mall and BIA is very interested in this project. It's a good project, bringing needed retail at grade and residential, and the NCC has been working hard on this project for some time. So the request today is, since Public Works is renovating many, many buildings on Spark Street, and it is a major construction site, a great challenge to the retail owners on that street to try to maintain a lively street in the midst of all the hoarding and the construction sites. So the request to the city from the BIA today is, please help us during this construction phase, help us maintain an attractive hoarding, help us with the deliveries and all the work that has to be done so that Spark Street can continue to keep the businesses alive and active. So we're looking forward to working closely with the city during this construction phase to make sure that it's not an added pressure to the street that is causing problems for the retailers. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Members of committee, thank you, Councillor. Is the item carried? Carried. If I could just go back, is Michael Powell here? Councillor, can we deal with item number 10? Okay. So, Mr. Trumbull, Mr. Cohen, and Mr. Hoban, we're on item number 10. And Councillor, I know we have a small amendment with respect to where the Section 37 benefits with respect to housing go, and Section 37 benefits are supposed to be accrued to the ward in which they were generated, so we're amending that small point to ensure that the $317,000 that is paid with respect to the affordable housing program goes to projects within Ward 14, which is Councillor Holmes' ward. Councillor, do you want to speak to this, or?
Presentation from the owners, or are they just here?
I'm going to get them to. Well, do you want to speak first, Mr. Cohen? Is it a? Now, is it a long speech or is it a short speech? Okay, you want to just give your opposition? Members of the committee, do we need Mr. Hoban or Mr. Tremblay? No. Gentlemen, thank you. Mr. Cohen, if you just want to tell us you're opposed, that would be fine. You need to put on your microphone, Mr. Cohen. There you go.
Is that it? First thing I want to do is thank staff. There was a lot of agonizing discussion and debate with staff about some of the issues, and we reached a compromise, and I appreciate the effort and energy, and I hope it works out. In the matter of Section 37, my client is not opposed to paying 37, and although the amount was increased, my client is prepared to pay the increased amount. My client did, however, want to contribute monies to public art. My understanding of the report is that all 100% will be devoted to affordable housing. There is no connection between what my client is doing and the affordable housing issue, and I'm asking this committee to allow some of that money to be devoted to public art. So we're not in a fight about the fact or even the amount, but the application in this circumstance is, sir, inappropriate.
So just to sum up, you're happy with the amount, not happy is a bad word, but you're
prepared to accept.
You're accepting of the amount,
yes,
and the requirement to pay it. You just think rather than housing, it should go to art.
At least some of it, sir.
Right. Okay. Are there questions from members of committee? From members of committee, Mr. Cohen? Oh, Mr. Cohen, thank you very much. Councillor Holmes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is part of a CDP, which is the usual state in Somerset Ward. This CDP, like the other CDPs, is brought forward when there are people buying property speculatively and wanting major increases in the development, much higher than the present zoning. And so a community development plan was established for Carling Preston, and 18 stories was determined to be the height on Rochester Street, which is what this particular application was looking for. We see in this particular development, Mr. Chair, this is a transit-oriented development, close to transit, and we have double the parking being provided in this building than the bylaw requests. Bylaw is for 0.5 numbers, which would be about 59 spaces, and we have 108 parking spaces provided in this development. So it is far from being a transit-oriented development. But the major debate has been over the visitor parking, because once again, we're not providing the visitor parking that's needed for this area in the bylaw, although the bylaw is asking for twice what the old City of Ottawa bylaw is. And so we are going with the old City of Ottawa bylaw for visitor parking. But even with the old city, we still are not coming up to the numbers that the old city would have requested in its time. And there's no visitor parking for commercial. And it's going to be commercial at grade now. What development around the City of Ottawa doesn't provide parking for commercial uses? Because, and this is the standard reply, that there's lots of parking on street. And there are parking lots in this area, which is exactly what was true of Laurier in the downtown. So over time, this parking on the street and the parking lots will be developed, and all that parking on the street, if we continue to give the public parking to developers for their visitor parking, of course, that public parking on the street will decrease and decrease. And we will be in the same situation here that we're in the downtown, where there's not enough public parking on the streets. So Mr. Chair, the community has been opposed to the visitor parking matter, that there's not enough visitor parking, that the visitor parking is not in the building, but it is using up public spaces for that visitor parking. The other question of mine, Mr. Chair, is the confidential urban design review panel. Was that a confidential meeting? It says confidential in the report, but I know that that is up for discussion, so I'm wondering.
Mr. Chairman, at the time that this application went through the process and with respect to the rezoning, yes, it fell under the rules that were in place at that time, and through the site plan, the Urban Design Review Panel meeting would in fact be a public, open to the public. We have since changed, and beginning in January, there is no more mandatory pre-consultation, so all UDRP sessions would be open to the public.
Thanks, Mr. That's good to hear. From now on, all the discussions will be open to the public and members of the community can attend. That's very helpful, Mr. Chair. So on balance, Mr. Chair, it's good to see this residential here on this site. Good to see some interesting, we hope, retail at grade, but there is a problem with the parking. Pardon?
Nicastro's, if I'm not wrong.
Well, if Nicastro's agrees and we get it signed on the dotted line, that will be very interesting, very helpful for that community.
Absolutely.
So on balance, we're still debating the visitor parking matter in the community and with various developers. On the matter of Section 37, we've had a very long discussion with the owner and the community and the department, and we have come down. The community is strongly requesting affordable housing money, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
And we're close to getting enough to actually do something with it, and it would be in this neighborhood, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor. Mr. Mizia, just on the issue of visitor parking and where the right, the old City of Ottawa sort of, and we have some in this application, but maybe at some point in time you would like to tell us, not today, but maybe through memorandum, what you see across the country as sort of the appropriate level of visitor parking for applications such as this, because I can't believe it's all zero across the province. It may not be what the old city had. There's got to be some sort of other demonstrated measure, and if you could provide that information to the committee, I think it would be very helpful for our future just debates and discussions, not only at the committee but in the community.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We will do that. Perfect.
Okay. Councillor Harder has moved the minor amendment with respect to Section X of Part 19 of the zoning bylaw contained in Document 3 that adds the words "for projects within Ward 14. Oh, you have a question. Okay. You're going to have to wave at me when you... Okay, sorry. This impersonal place to conduct committee business. But go ahead, Councillor Hobbs.
Thank you.
Before we call that.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask a question of staff in regards to the Section 37. And I'm not sure the CDP that's involved here, but I know the CDP for Preston Carling, we were planning on putting all the Section 37 money into specific improvements in this area. And so I just wanted to understand what the goal was initially for Section 37 for this particular development.
Mr. Chairman, the CDP has not yet been finalized. In fact, that's something that's being finalized right now, and it's actually going to be a secondary plan that's going to be coming forward, flowing from the strategic directions. The strategic directions is basically was established as an overall council directions for dealing with the ongoing development activity that was happening in the Preston Carling area. Once the secondary plan is in place, it will define more specifically the parameters around which we would be moving forward with future development developments, and we're also looking at including in that direction with respect to the directing of Section 37 funds. In this particular situation, we didn't have that framework established, so while there was discussion that we would be looking to try to focus Section 37 funds within the Preston-Carling area for various enhancements, there was never anything specifically defined for that, so it still falls under the official plan policies that do allow for consideration for the monies to be directed into affordable housing.
Okay, so thanks. So in the, once the CDP is passed, this sort of thing would not be allowed anymore? Well, would not be recommended in the CDP?
I'm not sure I would necessarily say it that way. We're still finalizing that CDP. One of the directions in the CDP/secondary plan is to provide direction for the use of Section 37. Now, that will be a matter that comes before committee and council for final discussion and decision. But we are looking at establishing an overall framework. It's not to say that there might not be continuation of $37 being directed towards affordable housing, but the intent is to specify it through the secondary plan.
Okay, because, not that I'm opposed to the assisted housing, but there are a lot of needs in this neighborhood, and so I just want to register my concern with that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. On the motion then, as presented, that the amendment is for this is for the social housing, affordable housing program for projects within Ward 14. Is that carried? Carried. On the item then, is it carried? Carried. So, can members of committee, in order to, this is going much faster than we had planned, can we go to section, no, we don't want to slow it down. Can we go to item number 12, which we do have a speaker. On that, we can hear from the speaker and then decide on that item. Councillor Hobbs, is that all right if we do item number 12? It's a relatively, should be a relatively quick one. Ms. Long, would you like to come down? You want to speak to committee? Just any one of the microphones there. No, it's a button to the. There you go.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to the Planning Committee. I'm representing the Hittenburg Community Association today, and we're talking about this application for zoning bylaw amendment at 1040 Somerset. The Hittenburg Community Association is opposed to the granting of the application to amend the zoning bylaw to allow a 30-story building at 1040 Somerset Street West in general. In our view, the height and density of this proposal are not appropriate to the community context in which it is located, as I've outlined below. One, we believe that the recently approved 23-story building at 1050 Somerset is not correctly cited as context. While there is indeed a 23-story portion, that portion is located behind a 6-story podium that extends approximately 50 feet in from Somerset. Therefore, any use of this building for context must also include the fact that it is only 6 stories for the entire portion within the traditional Main Street zone. The height of the podium facing Somerset Street is 5 to 6 stories. In contrast, there has been no attempt in the design of 1040 Somerset to conform to the traditional Main Street height or to provide similar step-backs. No rationale is provided for this failure to conform to the bylaw. The planner notes that further west along Somerset Street West are located other high-rise buildings ranging from 10 to 16 stories. These buildings were built in the 1970s and 80s when a different bylaw was in place. These buildings would not be permitted under the present traditional Main Street zoning established by the CDP, where a maximum of 9 stories is permitted at gateway sites identified in the plan. 2, the proposal is not in keeping with the emerging concepts for the rest of Gladstone Station District Community Design Plan. 2 of the 3 concepts proposed by the consultant recommend medium profile development of the lands south of 1040 Somerset opposite Devonshire School. This proposal has been considered without reference to the CDP, which was underway before the proposal was submitted to the Planning Department. As far as we know, the applicant was not asked to delay his application until the CDP study was completed, as was done for the CDP on Scott Street. 3, the comparison with the heights approved for the Bayview Station District CDP on the north side of Somerset Street Bridge is inappropriate. The grade from which the heights are calculated is at least 8 meters lower than the grade at 1040 Somerset. Also, the sites where a 30-story maximum height is recommended are located at considerable distance from other land uses, which could be impacted by intense development. The heights recommended in the vicinity of the low-rise residential neighborhood are 4 to 6 stories directly across the street, rising to 12 stories on the other side of the city center drive. This is not a mixed-use development, in our view. 204 square meters in a 30-story, 284-unit residential building is token at best. 5, the Hindenburg Community Association requested that the applicant provide shadow studies that show the impact of both 1050 Somerset and 1040 Somerset, since the combined impact of 2 buildings of this scale by the same developer in close proximity are likely to have a greater impact on the residential and commercial uses to the north than is revealed by the individual studies. To date, we have not been provided with these studies. 6, traffic. The staff report cites the community transportation study that concludes that the proposed development will result in a modest increase in traffic on most of the adjacent roadway network. The only improvement required to the transportation system is the installation of a traffic light at the intersection of Breeze Hill Avenue North and Somerset Street West. The report fails to mention that this signal is not warranted by traffic volumes, but is required because of limited sightlines due to the configuration of the Somerset Street Bridge. Nor does the staff report indicate that a continuous advance warning beacon is required to warn westbound Somerset Street traffic. It also admits that westbound left turns from Somerset to Breeze Hill Avenue must be restricted during the weekday peak PM. Traffic will thus be diverted to Bayswater Avenue, another residential street. This is not the only intensification to be expected on this block, since it is part of the mixed-use center associated with the Gladstone LRT station. The presence of Devonshire Public School on the west side of Breeze Hill makes traffic issues even more critical. That extraordinary measures are required to suggest to us that this site is not appropriate for the proposed scale of development. 7, transit-oriented development. This building is equidistant from 2 transit stations. The official plan proposes that the greatest height and density should be closest to the stations, a condition that this site does not meet. Number 8, Section 37 benefits. There have been no consultations with the community about the allocation of Section 37 funds as required by the policy adopted by Council, as required by the implementation principles of the Section 37 implementation bylaw. 2.8, the ward councillor, community groups and area residents shall participate in determining what benefits should be the subject of negotiation between the city and the owner-developer. It is desirable and encouraged that an analysis and identification of existing and potential needs and services be done in advance of the receipt of any planning application. The purpose of such analysis is to assist in setting the determination of appropriate type of community benefits. Community groups are encouraged to compile a list of community priorities annually. In sum, we have 3 points to make in this regard. First, we believe that consultation with nearby community is required for each rezoning, not just once and then delegated forever. Secondly, while the proposed improvements to Tom Brown Arena are certainly within the list developed for the West Wellington CDP and the neighborhood plan, there are other needs that might have been prioritized, such as a fund for affordable housing or funding for an expansion of the Rosemount Library as listed in the Wellington West Community Design Plan. And thirdly and lastly, we do not believe that the multi-use plan identifies in any way that it is community benefit. It is redundant to the path immediately and recently opened on the other side of the O-Train tracks, which is accessible from Somerset only a few meters from this development site. This proposed path, furthermore, only will lead to this particular building. It is a benefit for residents of this building only, not for the community, and is not needed. Furthermore, it was raised and rejected at community meetings. We object to this path being considered an appropriate community benefit, respectfully submitted by the Community Association located in Hindenburg. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harder has a question.
And then what?
Sure.
I have a question of you, and then I have a question of staff from something that you said, but I thought because you know, we've seen this coming, this application. I thought that I saw comments from the Hindenburg Community Association in support of this. In the media, I also wasn't surprised yesterday when we were updated by the chair, not the chair, sorry, the committee coordinator, that as of, I think, in the afternoon yesterday, there wasn't anyone signed up to speak, and I thought that that was just in keeping with the comments. So at what point did this change?
Am I on? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so as far as the community association goes, we're all a volunteer organization.
Yep.
One of our members has been away for a few days, and so there was a bit of a conflict as to who was coming and who wasn't coming. So I'm here, and we have had these objections for some time. And as you can see, it's well documented. The community association is very active in zoning issues. These comments have always been part of our position.
I guess that's part of why I'm asking, because you're right, the Hindenburg Community Association has been very active.
Yeah.
But through the process, or any part that I've, you know, been privy to or paid attention to or saw in the press or whatever, the comments haven't been negative. So I was actually not surprised to see that no one had signed up. And I guess you did later yesterday, is that right?
Okay. Yeah, we did have a zoning committee meeting last night at our community association, and these comments have been being developed over the last week or so since the most recent document was presented regarding this development. There were some changes made to it, and so we were addressing partly those changes, which were, I think, minimal, but we've always been opposed to this development. Yeah.
And I don't know that staff had a sense of that. Thank you for your response. My question is on the Section 37 and all the comments you made about the fact that you hadn't been consulted and hadn't been taken to heart. I don't get any Section 37. Most of the people around the table don't. But if I looked at Councillor Fleury and Councillor Hobbs, for example, who do, and because of their neighborhoods, do, I don't think that I would, in my mind, and I'm asking, I guess, Mr. Smet or Mr. Moser, is that not putting the cart before the horse, that you'd have a discussion on how to spend money on something that wasn't even approved yet?
Mr. Chairman, I think if you look at the Section 37 guidelines approved by Council, the various wards within which there might be the ability to deal with development approvals that would be able to allow for Section 37 agreements to be entered into very much encourages the various local councillors to work with their communities to identify potential Section 37 benefits that might be able to be secured through various Section 37 agreements within those wards. So there is that direction there, and there's also, under the guidelines, in terms of what a developer might feel might be appropriate for a Section 37 contribution. And then there's also direction that these could be spelled out in community design plans.
I think we all get all that, but I think that what's being commented on here is the fact that that hasn't been nailed down at this point. And I find that in speaking with Councillor Holmes, who isn't here anymore, for example, and talking about all the projects that she wanted to do, talking to her community and putting it all together, that it's not just the Section 37 might have an impact. Something that, for example, Councillor Fleury might do might have an impact and a benefit to something Councillor Holmes might do, and they might collaborate on sharing that. So is it strange that a decision on the spending of Section 37 on this yet-to-be-approved item has not been defined yet and is not a done deal?
Mr. Chairman, it has been defined, and in fact, the improvements to the Tom Brown Arena lands were identified as an area of priority, and under the 37 agreement, we actually have to identify where the monies are going to be directed towards, so it has been confirmed through the process, and that is identified in the report.
And so the Linda Hode, I know, for example, has come before committees and talked about that, Tom Brown, and I know she's very involved. Okay, thanks for the clarification. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hobbs?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Ms. Long, I just need to ask you a couple of questions. Thanks. I was concerned to hear you say that there was an issue with the new signals at Breeze Hill and Somerset. That has been something, to my understanding, that has been asked for by the Hintonburg Community Association for many years. And so has there been a change in that, or is it just being opposed now because it facilitates the traffic into Breeze Hill for this development? Because from what my understanding was and what I've heard over again from the Hintonburg Community Association is that they wanted to protect the safety of children walking across the road at Busy Road now. So has there been a change in
No, I don't think we haven't had a change in our position on it. It's always been that that particular intersection is a risky one at best for stopping, coming over a bridge as it is, a blind intersection. So there will be two developments there now, one in each corner, which will add to the volume of traffic coming and going there. So the traffic light issue has always been there. It's, I think, amplified, if you will, by this additional 30-story building that's being proposed. Does that answer your question?
Well, maybe I misunderstood. When you were talking about it, it sounded like you were not happy with it being there as a result of the developments, that the only reason it's there doesn't meet warrants and it's only there because of these developments. And that wasn't my understanding from the Hintonburg Community Association viewpoint over the last 3 years.
What was it? We weren't happy with what? I'm not sure what your question is.
I may have misunderstood in your comments where you said you were feeling that this intersection light was not warranted and it's only being put in now because of these developments. So I wasn't sure if you were against that light or if you were for that light because it's been asked for the last 3 years since I've been here by the Hintonburg Community Association. So I just wasn't sure why it was in what context it was in your presentation today.
Right. Okay. Well, can I get back to you on that, Councillor Hobbs? I'm not sure how to answer your question right now.
Okay, and I just have another question on the Section 37. We did send a request out, we have a number of times, the Hintonburg Community Association. We asked by the end of December for a list of all the Section 37 benefits. There's 2 CDPs in this area, and there was an agreement with the president of the Hintonburg Community Association that we would be using the monies that come from developments for those Section 37 benefits. You had a meeting last night. Was that position changed on that previous agreement on Section 37 dispensation?
No, I think what you're referring to is a general shopping list, I guess.
That's right,
Section 37 type of requests. So I can't comment on it any further than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Ms. Long.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Ms. Grahuta, Mr. Mahatra, Mr. Cleese, do you need to speak to us? I mean, do you have... Okay, does any member committee have any questions for Mr. Grahuta and Mr. Mahatra? No? Okay, thank you very much. Members of committee, on the item then? Is it carried? Carried. Okay, thank you very much. We will go back to item number 8.
Mr. Chairman, we'll have Ms. Bliss Edwards provide an overview of the application on Laurier, which is the item that is now before committee, in terms of what the application is about and what the recommendations from the department are.
Okay. Jacobs. Okay, don't need Jacobs.
morning, Mr. Chair. Before you, we have an application to amend the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan and a zoning bylaw to allow a 9-story, mid-rise, mixed-use apartment building with ground floor commercial. The property, indicated by the star on the screen, is located east of the university. Oh, sorry. The property is located east of the University of Ottawa's main campus, west of the Rideau River, in the Sandy Hill neighborhood. The transitway is approximately 600 meters to the southwest, and the university campus begins approximately 300 meters to the west. The subject site at the corner of Laurier and Friel has an approximate frontage of 80 meters along Laurier Avenue East and approximately 50 meters along Friel Street for a total of approximately 4,000 square meters. The site, the surrounding the site is predominantly low and mid-rise residential uses, with some commercial located at grade to the west and east along Laurier Avenue, and again commercial at Friel and Wilbrod. The surrounding area again has several mid-rise buildings abutting the site to the north. To the rear, to what would be considered the rear of this subject property, is a 7-story apartment building, with a 7-story apartment building also located across Laurier to the south. To the west of the property, across Nelson, is a 9-story apartment building, with another 9-story apartment building also located to the southwest of the property, approximately 100 meters away. Further east along Laurier, there are additional apartment buildings within the range of 13 to 15 stories. The site currently contains 4 low-rise apartments with surface parking at the rear of the property. The site is well suited to supporting a mixed-use development. The surrounding area contains a predominance of residential and commercial uses, and the general urban designation supports the proposed uses. The proximity of the site to the University of Ottawa and the central business area offers convenience for residents, and the commercial uses will be supported by pedestrians traveling to and from these areas. Additionally, the road network can easily accommodate a minor increase in traffic, and the site is located in close proximity to transit. The property is designated general urban area on Schedule B of our official plan. This permits a wide range of housing types and commercial uses. The proposed development will contribute to the range of housing options available in the area and builds upon desirable established patterns and built form while taking into consideration the planned vision for the area. The proposed at-grade retail use is conveniently located along Laurier Avenue East and is of a scale that will serve the needs of the surrounding neighborhood. The site is designated low-profile residential in the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan. The purpose of the policies contained in the Secondary Plan are to guide future growth and change in Sandy Hill. The policies specific to the residential designation are directed to preserving and enhancing good housing stock, locating different types of housing in appropriate areas, and to provide a wide variety of housing. The proposed official plan amendment, in combination with the proposed zoning, will allow Laurier Avenue to continue to evolve into a mixed-use area for the residential community. Introducing medium-profile residential that allows commercial use, that serves the community, builds upon these objectives of the secondary plan that strive to preserve and enhance Sandy Hill as an attractive residential neighborhood, especially for family living. The proposal will help ensure that a broad range of socioeconomic groups are accommodated and that the density of the area is increased. And lastly, that the function of the area as a residential neighbor and the home to the University of Ottawa is maintained and coordinated. The addition of the commercial uses will complement and be consistent with the existing commercial located to the west. You can see on the screen that there is a number of commercial nodes within the low-profile residential designation of the secondary plan, and they're indicated by the purple circles. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment will change the existing zoning from R4T to a general mixed-use zone with an FSI of 3.9 and a site-specific height schedule. The site-specific exceptions will permit a reduction in the required parking and allow for the 32-meter 9-story height, as well as reduced yard setbacks. The key site-specific provisions deal with, again, the reductions in certain yard requirements, parking, and height. The site-specific height schedule ensures that what you see on the screen and the renderings that you have seen are what is actually built. The increase in height to 32 meters is considered supportable in this case, as the site is located on a corner lot along a major collector as identified in the official plan. The site is within an area of low to mid-rise buildings, and to provide a transition, the building massing incorporates large stepbacks to the south along Laurier, to the east along Friel, and the north where there are budding buildings. The bylaw again sets out a height schedule in the range of 12 to 32 meters. The building proposed, as on the screen, it will have approximately 16,000 square meters and contain 180 units. There is a commercial space of approximately 1,200 square meters proposed for the ground floor to enliven Laurier Avenue. The proposed commercial uses would serve the needs of the future residents and the local community. In addition to the commercial uses, there will also be approximately 400 square meters of amenity space and a fitness center at grade. The building is proposed to be E in shape with step backs above the third floor. You can see that they're visible here on the screen. And the area between the wings will provide open space and courtyards to be used as plazas or patios, with the east courtyard providing the primary entrance to the building. The location of the single entrance maximizes the retail frontage along Laurier Avenue and wrapping around Friel Street. The outdoor plaza areas and courtyards again wrap around the corner of Laurier and Friel, and what you'll notice on this screen is that there is, one of the existing houses on the site is being restored. It doesn't currently look like that, but I'm told that's what it looked like at one time, and is being preserved on the site. There will be one level of underground parking with 63 parking spaces and secure bicycle storage. The vehicle access for the site will be from Friel, while the primary pedestrian access will be from Laurier. Through the site plan process, Laurier and Friel will be enhanced with landscaping along both street edges. The setbacks proposed in the bylaw provide for a reduced rear yard setback for a portion of the building and an increased setback provision for the portion of building above the third story for an additional 4 meters. So along Laurier, you can see the building rises, it's set back 3 meters off Laurier, rises up 3 meters, and then step backs an additional 4 meters, which we consider to be appropriate for what you see in the context along Laurier and picks up along of the heights of the historical buildings to the west. The requested reduction in, there's a reduced westerly side yard to create a continuous street frontage with the historical building along Laurier Avenue East. There is, again, a requested reduction in the rear yard setback along Friel. This is to maintain an interior side yard condition adjacent to the buildings along Friel because it is a corner lot, and through the bylaw we are proposing to recognize Laurier Avenue as the front yard, whereas as our bylaw is written, technically Friel would be considered the front yard. So a lot of the reductions are because we are proposing to recognize Laurier as the front yard. With respect to the additional permitted uses, the proposal includes commercial units within the building that front on Laurier Avenue East. These additional uses will contribute to the community, bringing the daily needs of the residents closer to their homes, reducing reliance on cars, and at the same time making for a more complete community. In summary, the proposed development supports the city being a place where all citizens are accommodated in a variety of housing. The proposed secondary plan and zoning bylaw amendment conform with the general intent of the official plan and existing zoning in the area, and we are recommending approval. Go to the next one.
Okay, can you bring me back to the base planning framework and the reason why you believe that it's appropriate to modify the policy plans that would allow this to go forward? Because, and this is one of the unique times where we're not only having a zoning bylaw, but we're amending the official plan. And I just want to encapsulate that succinctly, why we believe that that's a good thing.
Mr. Chairman, in this instance, you're correct. I mean, there is a secondary plan that's in place in Sandy Hill. It's a secondary plan that was established in the 1970s. The secondary plan provides for broad-based land use designations that are applicable throughout the area, ranging from high-profile, medium-profile, low-profile residential on the actual land use designation, as well as a couple of commercial designations, open space. The policies that are associated with the Sandy Hill secondary plan, however, are very high level. Ms. Edwards did identify that there are no specific policies directed to low, medium, or high-profile residential. Rather, there's a general policy that talks about residential as a whole, and it talks about improving the residential character of Sandy Hill, protecting some of the unique elements of the residential fabric within the community, but also recognizing the opportunity for a mixture and a diversity of residential types to accommodate a range of potential residents. When we look at the particular site and we look at what exists in this particular area, and I think Ms. Edwards, through the aerial photograph, did clearly identify that this is not a low-profile residential area today. It, in fact, has a number of medium-profile and, in fact, some high-profile residential development immediately adjacent to the block and in the area generally. So the importance from our perspective was making sure that whatever happened on this property fit within the notion of the continuation of a good street environment that was focused on maintaining sort of a lower profile condition along the edges, but having an opportunity for some high profile or medium profile more internal to the site, which fit within the overall fabric. So the overall assessment then defers also to looking at this in the context of the primary plan, which does provide a lot of direction in terms of the considerations that need to be had in considering increases in height within the general urban area. And one of the key things that's talked about is the existing conditions within those neighborhoods. So the department is very satisfied within the framework of the primary plan, policies associated with the general urban area, policies associated with urban design and compatibility, as well as the overall direction for residential areas in the Sandy Hill secondary plan, that this amendment to the secondary plan to allow for a medium profile development is appropriate. And I think also when you look at the Sandy Hill secondary plan schedule, we in fact do see that an area that is designated for commercial is flanked to the north by a medium profile residential, and we feel it very appropriate that that designation also be established here.
So, how old is the Sandy Hill secondary plan?
It dates back to 1976, so it's in excess of 30 years old.
Okay.
40 years old, sorry.
So now, and this is the First Amendment in how long?
This is not the First Amendment, Mr. Chairman. There's been a couple of minor amendments that have been made to the secondary plan. I recall one in particular, which was on Range Road, where we have the existing high-rise building. There was an amendment there as well.
So we're getting to the point where it may need, and Councillor Fuller, you may need to think about how we would reinvigorate, for lack of a better terminology, the secondary plan so that it provides an appropriate planning framework for this period of time in our city's development. I leave that to you to contemplate. But I have a couple of questions before we get to general questions. Mr. Mark, I'd like to come up. There's been a lot of swirl around the city's ability, and it leads me to believe that there'll be some discussion at the committee with respect for the ability to say who can live where. And I guess I need to understand, and I think we need to clarify what our legal authority is with respect to regulating the type of buildings that can be built, where they can be built, and what we can't regulate, which is who actually lives in those buildings. So can you just provide a little bit of the framework that says, look, you can't say that only people who are 50 years and older can live here, and 20 and under can live here, and only families can live here. I mean, it's common that we would say we don't people zone, but there's, I think we're going to get into a discussion about whether or not we should be able to people zone, and I think it's good for the committee to understand the legal context within which we would operate. There you go.
Mr. Chair, certainly the city can and does zone by dwelling type. That's well established. That's within the legal ability of the city. But as you indicated, we cannot zone by the nature of the person living in that building. So we can't zone for singles versus families. The city cannot zone for students versus others. That's not permitted under the Planning Act, Mr. Chair.
Is there any legislative authority that would allow us to do that?
No, Mr. Chair.
So, in my ward, I have a facility that's a retirement home. There's nothing, and they call it a retirement home. There's nothing for me to say only people who are retired can live there.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. There's no legal. I just want to go back at this. There's no legal authority in any statute. And is there anywhere else that would allow us to do that? And I want to I'm trying to nail this down so that Mr. Mark, well, someone else does it, so request special legislation. Do you follow what I'm trying to say?
I follow what you're trying to say, Mr. Chair, and no, the city cannot zone by the nature of the person living there. It would be in violation of the Human Rights Code. There's a specific provision in the Planning Act that deals with the question. So it's not something that's open to the city. The city is restricted you can zone by zoning type, but you cannot zone by the nature of the person living there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mark. Ms. Snedden, where's Ms. Snedden? Oh, I saw her. Okay. I'll ask her the question about where we are with respect to conversions in a minute. Okay. I think that's all the questions I have. Are there other questions for Mr. Smith or Ms. Edwards? Councillor Hubley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the picture, I see the green around the rooftops. Is that going to be a space that can be used?
Yes, it is planned to be used, but controlled. They're not necessarily balconies for individual units.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Do you have any questions, Councillor? No? Okay. Okay, so let's go to delegations then and if you can find Ms. Snedden, I'd be interested to know where and when the conversion, the results of the conversion program will be before us, because
Maybe I can help out, Mr. Chairman. We did send an email to Ms. Sneddon, but my understanding is that the report dealing with the conversions is going to be before Planning Committee at its meeting March 25th, I believe.
so in a month's time, the issue of property conversions will be before us.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Right, and the results of the directions that we're heading to date?
Directions that are being pursued is to eliminate converted dwellings as a permitted use in the zoning bylaw, which doesn't preclude somebody from taking an existing dwelling and converting it. However, rather than being able to take advantage of the performance standards of the use that's being converted, the new use, the converted use would have to meet the performance standards for the new use. So in short, if you have a single-family dwelling and you want to turn it into a 4-unit, it becomes a low-rise apartment, which means you now meet the performance standards for a low-rise apartment, not the performance standards for a single-family dwelling.
Which is almost impossible to do in some cases, in most cases.
That's right. You would need variances. So there's a greater level of control and review and scrutiny that would be given to these initiatives, but the bottom line is the use that it's being converted to is what the use would be treated as in the context of the zoning bylaw.
Okay. Good. Any other questions? Okay, let's go to delegations then. Anna Marie Melanson. Sorry if I didn't get that right. Would you like to come up? Okay. No, yeah,
Mr. Chair, members of this committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Anna Marie Melanson. I'm a long-term resident of Sandy Hill. I have over the years enjoyed a community that was healthy and vibrant with a social mix of professional, families, retired people, and students. I am opposing the bylaw rezoning amendment and construction of the tower for university students, because I believe this project development will negatively impact on the very social fabric of this community. This off-campus high-rise will not only change the cultural heritage of Sandy Hill, but will also create a ghetto type of out-of-control rowdy student. As a resident of 400 Friel for over 26 years, I have witnessed the degradation of our neighborhood in apartment buildings because of landlords renting predominantly to university students. These tenants are transient in nature, meaning their renting period often does not exceed 8 to 9 months. Because of their short stay and without on-site surveillance, they have often showed total disregard for other tenants residing in the building. They frequently have large gatherings in their apartment, they play loud music, and then drinking parties have become common occurrences. They show a total lack of accountability. Landlords simply cannot ensure safety of other tenants. I have, on many occasions, witnessed destruction of property from students demonstrating out-of-control behavior. So many times I have called the city bylaw to complain about the noise. Let us not forget what happened a few years ago during the St. Patrick's Day event. It started midday on a Saturday. Sandy Hill was under siege with large gathering of loud, drunken, irresponsible students roaming the neighborhood streets and having rooftop parties with loud music. The city was ill-prepared to handle such a large crowd of students roaming the streets. And the landlords of these apartment buildings were nowhere to be seen to control the situation or police their own properties. Sandy Hill community has always been characterized as a nice green living place for all demographics. But over the years, this has changed. And if this project goes forward, we will witness a moral decay of society and community living. The only winning party here is this big private developer making huge profits at the cost of our community. The city will have no choice but to add extra police resources in order to keep the community and homeowners safe. On a personal level, this also means I will have to move out to a more expensive apartment. Renting in Sandy Hill has become unaffordable because of inflating renting prices. Greedy landlords have increased rent at a much higher percentage of what would normally be permitted in a more stable tenant that lived there. I am personally inviting all members of this community, as well as members of Action Sandy Hill, to come and visit my apartment unit and see the building for yourself. I have well kept my apartment. I just recently invested over $2,000 of my personal money to fix holes in the ceiling because the owners had let go of the apartment. I will leave my coordinates to the scribe, and I'm sincerely hoping you will accept my invitation and come and visit the building, 400 Friel, and my apartment unit. It is lovely. There's great potential of improving the site if the owners would invest a bit of money. And I'm also asking you to please take the time to walk down Laurier Avenue and Friel Street and see how beautiful these streets and buildings are before making such a drastic decision to demolish this building. Thank you for letting me speak and for your attention.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Ms. Melanson? Thank you very much for your presentation. Chad Rowlands. Mr. Rowlands, if you'd like to come up.
I should have a presentation. I'm not sure if it's ready there. I do have a few slides that I sent in. I'm just hoping they're able to...
Their technology is being technologicalized. That's a word, but... Are you...
Sure, we can go to someone else if you want who doesn't have slides.
What's that? Hold on. We'll... Okay, Mr. Rollins, we'll sit down. We'll find your presentation. Diane Beckett, if you'd like to come up.
Hello. I'm a resident of Sandy Hill, and I'm pleased to speak with you today. It is clear that this proposed development does not fit with the neighborhood, as it necessitates an official plan amendment to the Sandy Hill secondary plan. The change that the proponent is requesting would more than double the allowable height. In addition, this application would result in a building mass that is totally inappropriate for a residential neighborhood. The land amassed for the project equals 1 acre, and one tall, dense building is being proposed to replace a number of much smaller buildings which have both historic interest and are in character with the neighborhood. Neither the proponent's proposal nor the city staff report lay out why this major change in the official plan and the secondary plan is justified. I would draw your attention to an article in the Ottawa Citizen regarding the recent OMB ruling concerning a project at 335 Roosevelt Avenue in Ottawa. To quote the article, David Reevely, the journalist, said, "In at least this specific case, according to the board, the city's urban planning department did exactly what its critics accuse it of doing all the time, ignoring residents' concern and changing the rules to suit whatever builders want." It seems to me that this is exactly what is happening here as well. In addition to the lack of justification for such major changes to the official plan and the secondary plan, the city makes erroneous arguments for the acceptability of the Viner proposal. Given the time constraints, I will mention only two. The proponent proposes to provide 63 parking spaces, which is less than half the number that is required by the city. Yet the city accepts this reduction in parking spots and says it's justified based on the fact that the proposed building will be a student residence and students are less likely to have a car. However, the planning rules do not allow buildings to be zoned for occupants. Second, the city planner's report claims that the building fits in because there are taller buildings in the vicinity. These buildings, however, are anomalies from the 1960s and 1970s and are the very buildings that resulted in the rules in the current secondary plan. For the city to use these anomalies to justify the new proposal certainly indicates a lack of knowledge of the history of the area and the rationale for the current secondary plan. And I would add that all these taller buildings have generous setbacks, so the impact on neighboring homes is much less than the proposed project. Laurier Avenue is both a historic and charming street. It has many lovely homes and several small apartment buildings that have been inhabited by at least 4 prime ministers, a leader of the opposition, numerous members of parliament, including Tommy Douglas, the father of Medicare, and many historic figures, including Billy Bishop, World War I flying ace. A princess was even married at All Saints Church on Laurier. In any other OECD or G8 country, a street with so much history and character would be developed with care and respect to increase tourism and bring significant financial benefits. Instead, the City Planning Department is recommending that the official plan and secondary plan be amended to allow the destruction of buildings that are totally in keeping with the history and character of the neighborhood, so that they can be replaced by a massive institutional building that is totally out of character. Although the proponent has proposed that the facades of some of these buildings be preserved, I do not believe that there is anything the city can do to ensure that happens. I am also concerned about the staff's warning to the committee that if they don't adopt the staff's recommendation, it might affect the operations of the department. This conveys a dismissive tone. Well, this only adds to the dismissive tone of the report with respect to community input. In conclusion, as the OMB so clearly demonstrated just last week, a major amendment to the official plan and the secondary plan requires a genuine rationale, which is completely lacking in this case. Thank you.
I'd like you to expand. What point do you think, where in their report does their warning to us that if we reject this, it would affect the operations of the department?
So it's alluded to under the legal implications section.
Okay.
I don't have...
You know what? I know where you're going now, and I'm so... We asked that we wanted to know what the costs were of the rejection, so that when we were judging that, we would know how much we would have to spend to defend City Council's decision should we choose to go the other way. But people are now, and we asked for that, members of Council. So it's not the department providing that information. So I take it where you're going to go, and maybe members of committee, this is not the first time that this has been brought up to us, that people assume that we're going to use this. We may need to strike this from our reports from now on, and because the community is twisting the reason why it was, or interpreting it, the reason why we asked for it. We asked for it for budgetary reasons, for no other reason than that, not to as a warning or a threat or an implication, because quite frankly, when council wants to go the other way, it really matters little to us how much it costs to defend that decision. We very rarely enters into the lexicon of why we should do or do not. So, but that was for our information, and we asked for that information. So it's not a threat on the part of the department, and you're not the first to say that, and we may now just strike that from our reports, because it's casting aspersions on the planning department that really aren't justified. So I'll just say that, and I'll thank you for raising that. Is there any other questions for the delegation? No. Thank you very much for your presentation. Judy Renfret, if she'd like to come up.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Planning Committee members. My name is Judy Renfret, and I am a longtime resident of Sandy Hill. I'm moved to speak to you today because I believe this project is, as it stands, not good for our community. I've spent a lot of time, frankly, ever since I arrived in Ottawa over 30 years ago, taking an active interest in planning issues, and I've studied them. I've attended every single session the city has offered, and I have also been a participant in planning issues in my neighborhood. But since the turn of the century, and that does make me sound old, I've certainly noticed a change in the planning culture at City Hall. Whereas our Planning Act clearly states that the onus is on the applicant to prove the need for a change in an official plan or the zoning bylaws, the onus seems to have passed to community. And that's a much, much heavier burden, and we are now finding ourselves defending what should not need defending, namely, in this case, our community's hard-won secondary plan. And although I've heard it said that it's nearly or more than 40 years old, which of course isn't true if you do the math, it was revised in the 80s, and our community has repeatedly asked that this plan be revisited, and we are told there's no budget to do it. So it stands. It's enshrined in the official plan, and it needs to be given the proper weight. The Viner family's property, as you see above, is unique. It's almost an acre. Unlike many downtown lots, it's both deep and wide. And so whatever is built on this site will have a profound effect on the community. I've carefully considered this massive project, and I remain unconvinced that this very significant increase in size and density is in the interests of good planning. The current bylaws, by the way, already allow much greater density than now exists on this lot. With an architect like Mr. Hoban, a structure that meets the purposes and intent of the official plan and bylaws is entirely feasible. In short, this property presents the perfect storm of an opportunity for intensification, and that's what we're all aiming for, without any significant change whatever to the development rights that now apply. I'm particularly concerned about the effect of the reduced yards on the immediate residential neighbors to the west and to the north. A structure of this mass and height would be undeniably intrusive. They'll have adverse effects on those properties. Think about the drastic reduction in winter light, the invasion of privacy. 60 windows will overlook the rear yards of the modest three-story homes on Nelson. If anything, yards on the sides abutting residential uses should be more generous than the bylaw demands. And remember, once this building's erected, it's forever, at least the forevers of those of us in this room. If it is a mistake, it cannot be corrected. Furthermore, as planners remind us, we zone a property, not who may live there. Although we're assured this will be a well-run, supervised student residence, there is nothing to guarantee that. Should the use prove impractical or unprofitable, the building could be assumed by another owner for very different occupants: hotel guests, boarders, tenants, condo owners. All promises of round-the-clock supervision are of no meaning. Good tenancy, though well-intentioned, is not guaranteed. Finally, I respectfully remind all of us that we have a duty to the property rights of others. If we accept overdevelopment on this property, Why not all properties in the R4T zone? How would our infrastructure support such development? How would we cope with park needs, public areas, transportation? Please consider this proposal from the points of view of fairness, public good, short and long-term outcomes. There is no reason to amend our official plan or zoning bylaws. What is currently proposed is neither necessary nor appropriate nor desirable. Thank you.
Are there questions for the delegation? I just had one. You said in your comments that you, and I use the broad you, have been repeatedly asking to update the CDP. So that's correct. So if we were to update the CDP, that's something that you think should be done, and you would support that?
Absolutely. We agree. We have all kinds of policies that need re-examination.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Are there questions for Ms. Renfret? Nope. Mr. Rowlands, apparently, thank you very much, Ms. Renfret, for your presentation. Mr. Rowlands, we have your presentation now, so if you'd like to come down.
Okay. Oh, great, it's up. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Chad Rollins. I'm a resident of Sandy Hill, and I'm here today primarily because I want to defend the importance of the Sandy Hill secondary plan, of which our city's planning department is so dismissive. We in Sandy Hill actually agree that it needs to be rewritten, but until such time, it is the only planning document relevant in this case, and no rationale whatsoever has been provided for its amendment here. I'd like to take a minute today to walk you along Laurier Avenue, which I would argue is probably one of the most significant historical streets in the city, behind Wellington and Sussex. From the west end with the University of Ottawa and Tabaret Hall and Lawn, which we see here, to the east with Strathcona Park, Laurier Avenue East is dominated by low-profile residential development and tree-lined boulevards, just as it has been since it was laid out by Louis Theodore Besserer in 1838. In fact, Laurier Avenue used to be called Theodore Street. Laurier has been home to 4 prime ministers whose houses still grace its boulevards, including Stadacona Hall, which was once home to Sir John A. Macdonald, and of course Laurier is so named in honor of Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier, whose home, Laurier House, is now a National Historic Site. Laurier is currently home to several embassies and important international institutions, including the Canadian headquarters of Amnesty International and the Angolan Embassy, both of which are shown here. It's important to note that the dominant character of Laurier Avenue remains low profile, as can be seen in all of the photos I'm showing today. The high-rise buildings referenced in the planning report are anomalies built in the 1960s and 70s. They do not contribute to the character of the area. In fact, they were the impetus for the creation of the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan, which made it clear that Laurier was to remain low-profile residential. Here we see a few more examples of some of the heritage homes along Laurier Avenue. These ones have been repurposed, but maintained in keeping with the character and heritage of the area. I'd like to draw your attention now to Schedule J of the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan, which identifies the permissible land uses in Sandy Hill. All the areas shaded in yellow are identified as low-profile residential. I'd like to zoom in on the area in question so it's a little easier to see. The arrow here identifies the site in question, and as you can see, the land at the corner of Laurier and Friel is shaded in yellow, denoting low-profile residential. The existing commercial area, seen here in purple, is grandfathered, but the secondary plan and zoning were designed to keep commercial uses contained to this part of the street and to prevent it from expanding east along Laurier. The height and mass of this proposal, along with the inclusion of commercial space, are inconsistent with the secondary plan. The proponent's image, shown here with Laurier Avenue to the left, clearly demonstrates that this building would loom over its surroundings. Another of the proponent's images, looking east along Laurier, shows again how the proposed building would dominate the area. The planning report has provided no rationale for changing the secondary plan to accommodate this development. The OMB's recent ruling and comments on 335 Roosevelt criticized the city's planning department, stating that, though staff have addressed many individual components of the project, the rationale for changing the mid-rise skyline itself was not just flawed, it was non-existent. The same thing is happening with this project. The planning department has provided no rationale for amending the Sandy Hill secondary plan, choosing instead to simply dismiss it. The existing buildings on the site, as shown here in the proponent's images, contribute to the character of the area. It's also worth noting that all these buildings have been identified in the Sandy Hill Heritage Study as being of heritage interest. Surely facadism is not the only way to preserve the character of this charming block. In fact, there exists already an excellent example just a few blocks east of this proposal for how Laurier can be developed successfully and sensitively. Barry Podolsky's infill project shown here saved 2 heritage houses and added a new condo building between and behind them in a manner that is barely noticeable. The existing buildings did not have to be demolished, nor was any extra height or other modifications to the zoning required. Mr. Chair, on your website you state that you believe community design plans articulate our expectations for how future development will integrate with our community. In the case of Sandy Hill, we have a secondary plan that is intended to do just that. So, Mr. Chair and members of the Planning Committee, I call on you today to reject this application and uphold the statutory importance of the Sandy Hill secondary plan, as the Planning Department has provided no rationale for amending it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for the delegation? I just want to talk to you about a little bit about 335 Roosevelt. It's a really quite an interesting case. I don't know if you've ever been before the Ontario Municipal Board, but the board is an evidentiary process. So you go and you present evidence to the board. In this case, the legal teams led a strategy, and they put evidence before the board, and the board looked at it and said, you didn't place any evidence about the reason to change from mid-rise to high-rise. You didn't lead with any evidence that he felt sufficient. That doesn't mean there wasn't evidence to be led. So it's like, it's like a court, where the court comes in and you present your evidence, and it's on that basis that a decision is rendered. It doesn't mean there wasn't evidence. You just didn't put it before the court. So there's a real distinction between what we're dealing with here and that process. And I'll leave it to the legal teams to say why they didn't lead with evidence that would have supported a move from mid-rise to high-rise. So sure. They're very clear, and I know it's a fine point, but it is a point that the board looked at it and said, you haven't given me any evidence. That's different than no evidence exists. And I'll just leave it at that. And I'm interested in a little bit, if you could expand upon, I understand defending CDPs. I've also been very clear that we need to modernize CDPs, because a lot of them, I'm going to argue that a 40-year-old one may need to be revitalized to meet the realities of a modern city. Because what was in the 70s and what we decided in the 70s may not be appropriate for the 2010s, 2014s, 2020s.
Sure.
So
I wouldn't challenge that at all. We would like, I think, generally speaking, in Sandy Hill, we would all appreciate that the Sandy Hill secondary plan be revisited and rewritten and brought up to date, because our experience with it for a long time has been that it's just dismissed. And so for it to be brought up to date would be a great thing. I think Ms. Rinford alluded to that, and I think maybe even Diane Beckett did as well. And that's needed. But until that happens, that's the planning document that applies. It's the planning document that this council, well, not this council, but City Council chose when the official plan was done after amalgamation to protect those existing secondary plans, to continue to follow and respect them, to continue to allow them to be more restrictive than the official plan itself. The province has reviewed and approved
but we have the ability
plan.
to change it too. So I understand that. The question is, and I'll pose it to you this way when you talk about the Sandy Hill secondary plan. You say it's dismissed. Is it a matter of dismiss or interpret differently? We interpret it differently to say this, you interpret it to say that. Because in my experience, a lot of the conflict is in the different parties interpret differently, and that's why we've had a drive to, and you'll hear us talk about certainty, predictability, so that everyone, that interpretation, I'm interpreting it to turn left, you're interpreting it to turn right, we don't have that. So is it a matter that you don't pay attention to it, or you interpret it differently?
I don't think it's a matter of interpretation. I think, honestly, in our experience as residents of the community, it seems to just be dismissed, not interpreted differently than we would interpret it. This site, I would say, is very clearly
I'm not talking about this site. I'm talking about in general.
Okay. In general, then, our experience is it's dismissed. I don't think it's an issue of interpretation.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, are there any other questions? Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Kathy Allison.
Hello, my name is Kathy Allison. I've lived in Sandy Hill for 17 years, and I'm opposed to this development for a number of reasons. First, the City of Ottawa has a secondary plan for the Sandy Hill area, which includes the location of the proposed development. We're not talking about the CDP. The current zoning bylaws do not allow a building of such height and mass to be erected. However, there is no justification provided in the staff report to explain why the proposed development should be approved. I remind you that some of the main objectives of the Sandy Hill secondary plan are to preserve and enhance Sandy Hill as an attractive residential neighborhood, especially for families, and to allow for a modest increase in population, mainly for those employed in the labor force for the central area of the city. This proposal is disturbing to those of us, many of whom are behind me, who understand the importance of respecting and preserving the built environment, especially in such a special area of the city that is so historically important, as you have already seen in Chad's presentation. In short, the proposed building is exponentially too tall and the mass too great to fit into the streetscape. Demolishing 5 buildings of historic importance is a sacrilege. Instead, these buildings should remain and, if necessary, can be restored, thus continuing the 150-year tradition of Laurier Avenue as a prestige locale for the finest of residences, as we can read in the 2010 Sandy Hill Heritage Study. There are not many streets left in Ottawa that harken back to this wonderful time, and there is no reason for the city to destroy or further eradicate its unique and exclusive character now. From the mid-1880s on, Theodore Street, now Laurier Avenue East, was the premier place to live. It was filled with grand residences on the former By estate. It was never conceived as a commercial street. The proposed building introduces commercial land uses where they were never intended to be. The proposed development sits at, or we can use the word abuts, the northern end of Sweetland Avenue, which is itself a heritage conservation district containing buildings of notable importance. As the Sandy Hill Heritage Study states, the overall cohesiveness of the heritage character of this area has been badly marred by insensitive and inappropriate high-rise development carried out with any regard for the existing heritage values of the study area. A 9-story stacked block will do nothing positive to complement the massing patterns, the rhythm, the character, and the context of Laurier Avenue East. While the proposal includes a nod to one aspect of one of the existing buildings through a reimagined facade, it does nothing to replace what is there now. Restoration is concerned with historical truth, not aesthetic appearance, historical imitation, or historical fantasy. Mr. Viner stated at a public meeting in November that the existing buildings have outlived their useful lives. However, many of us in Sandy Hill have purchased and live in buildings that are well over 100 years old, often having spent vast sums of money lovingly restoring them. In this exquisite neighborhood, citizens cherish their assets. We do not demolish. For someone with the financial means that he possesses, Mr. Viner could instead restore the buildings on the parcel of land he has amassed. This would make him a local neighborhood hero. Instead, I find the Viner application filled with discrepancies and ill-thought planning concepts. This proposal is all about cramming as many people as possible into as little space as possible. It is not about beauty, cultural preservation, or neighborhood pride. It is all about money. It is the opposite of exquisite. Let me give you some examples. The application contains photographs with graphic representations that are completely misleading. The scale of the building displayed in all of the composite photographs makes it appear to be the same height as the existing buildings. Yet at 9 stories, this building would be 3 times the height, a great hulking structure that would tower over this neighborhood road, removing the heritage character along that expanse of the avenue. And this is a grand avenue, not just any street or road. The traffic and parking study is also misleading. How can city staff approve the transportation brief when it contains such deceptive information, such as a parking study that was conducted on an August morning between 8 and 9 a.m.? There are few students around at that time of the day in the summer. However, come back on a weekday in September or March in the middle of the day and you'll rarely find an empty parking spot on Laurier or any of the surrounding streets. I believe this report does not paint a true picture of what the traffic situation will become. We've already talked about the issue of parking spots. Remember, planning staff, you have stated that you cannot limit or prevent a development based on who is going to live there. Yet the developer has significantly reduced the number of spots, describing their proposal as a purpose-built facility for students who don't have cars. Does this mean that if someone who is not a student wants to live there will be turned away? If, as you state, you don't zone for the type of occupants, then you cannot rely on the type of occupants to justify modifying the parking requirement. There is clearly flawed logic here. The bottom line is that this proposal must be denied. Instead, I ask the Planning Department and the Planning Committee to turn their attention to developing a student-wide housing policy. The effects of approving this proposal and other proposed developments like it are accumulative, and they set dangerous precedents for our beloved Sandy Hill. One final word. I find the overall tone of the staff report very bothersome. It is dismissive of the concerns of the citizens in the neighborhood, and its mere repetition of the analysis, findings, and summaries put forward by the developers is disturbing. I see only a one-sided position, not a careful deliberation of the issues presented to you by the community. Instead, I implore you to heed Joni Mitchell's warning. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for the delegation? Councillor Blows.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to finish the song for you, but it involves a parking lot.
By all means.
But it actually does bring me to a question, a point you've raised, and I think a couple of the other presenters, in terms of there is an inconsistency here in terms of saying that we don't zone for people or the type of people or what we expect future residents to be, and yet we're allowing a reduction, or we're proposing a reduction in parking here, and I think you've made a very valid point on that, and so have the others. So I guess there isn't really a question, but it's going to be a question to staff. How do you justify that if earlier on we had a legal opinion and we've got the staff opinion saying we don't zone for people or class of people or whatever, and yet we've done it with seniors' homes as well, and that may be because it's written right into the zoning bylaw. So I will be raising that. I won't raise it because you've made your point.
Yes, thank you.
But I'm going to take your question forward. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for the delegation? Nope. Thank you very much for your presentation. Dennis Jacobs.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I believe I have some slides,
And I think they're coming. Yep, we've got them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of committee. I'm here speaking on behalf of Action Sandy Hill, who have retained me to provide advice on this particular file. Copies of the slides have also been distributed to the members of committee this morning. I would like to start with a topic that's been raised by a number of people, which is certainly the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan. And it's the only statutory plan in effect and must be considered in that light. Council made a specific point about keeping these plans in place and allowing them to be more restrictive than the parent plan when the plan was, or official plan was originally adopted in 2003. That comes under section 4.1 and is quite clear that secondary plans can be more restrictive.
How many more speakers?
The proposed amendment to the Sandy Hill Secondary Plan is not a technical amendment, but a change in direction, or I would say vision, for the community. This significant change in community vision is not supported by a sufficient policy rationale to justify the change. The fact that a new development has come forward is not rationale. This proposal would impact both building height and land use, key determinants of community vision and character. The vision for this community, as shown on the schedule, is clearly primarily low-profile residential. This is not a downtown mixed-use area. This is intended to be a residential area. The existing plan cannot be dismissed as outdated without rationale. The current plan, as it stands, permits significant intensification and a mix of land uses and building profiles in keeping with the community character. These two are key policy foundations of the current parent official plan: community character and a mix of land uses and allowing intensification. Individual design elements are not sufficient rationale or justification to amend a secondary plan. There must be a clear demonstration how this amendment relates and is in keeping with the overall vision of the secondary plan as well as the official plan, not just the official plan. The existing area is well served by commercial development, and adding more on this particular site creates a change in that vision for this area. The change in scale of this magnitude for, as I described, the vision of this community is something that requires the greater involvement of community in the process that you find through a review of a secondary plan or through a community design plan process, not a simple notwithstanding type of amendment. The site is not in a designated target area for intensification, so community character, again, is the key design determinant, and this has not been addressed in this amendment to the secondary plan. The proposed bylaw cannot proceed without the OPA, and the reference to 9-story buildings as part of the community character is disingenuous. Construction of these buildings in the late 60s and early 70s was the whole reason that the neighborhood planning movement started in Sandy Hill, as well as many neighborhoods across Ontario. They were the result of the vision that's in the secondary plan and cannot be used as part of the character that was intended. The amendment allows more than double the height, 14.5 to 32 meters, along with significant reductions in rear and interior side yards, proximity to the adjacent buildings. The subject site is clearly outside the area identified for clusters of retail and commercial development, and this is not a traditional Main Street area. Those are clearly defined in the secondary plan. The subject, only a very small portion of the site is within 600 meters of a rapid transit station, and as one plans within that 600-meter planning area, we should be looking at reducing the level of intensification as we move further away. The site is interior to the community, and therefore the relationship to adjacent buildings is very important. There are potential adverse effects on Friel Street, which is a local street. The access to the garage and commercial loading area will have traffic implications. On the adjacent amenity areas, the west elevation of the building, as identified in the January 29, 2014 submission, appears to indicate that there will be in excess of 60 windows in the rear portion of the 9-story building, overlooking the outdoor amenity areas of 251 Laurier and 291 Nelson Street. At 4 stories, which is allowed under the current bylaw, this number would be reduced to approximately 25. So there would still be an impact, but that would be permitted under the current bylaw. The current R4T zone, which I am quite familiar with, allows significant redevelopment opportunities in keeping with the community character and was chosen specifically to allow that range of opportunities in housing type and style. In summary, it is my opinion that these applications should be refused as they do not satisfy the policy background that's required. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there questions for Mr. Jacobs? Maybe I can just, on the issue of parking, we've talked a lot about, the requirements for parking. I'm actually a proponent of providing no parking because if you want people to move transit, you should be providing parking encourages what we're trying not to encourage, which is greater transit, greater utilization of walking and cycling, especially in areas adjacent to the central business district. What's your opinion on the requirement for the provision of parking from a planning perspective, not necessarily particular to this application, but in the generic requirements? Because as you've heard, it's an issue here, it's an issue was an issue on Rochester Street, it's an issue generally.
Yes, and I think Mr. Chair, your official plan provides considerable direction with respect to looking to reduce parking standards where there is adequate transit in downtown locations and encouraging a focus on transit, cycling, and pedestrian movements in these areas. I can't comment on the specifics of this application. I didn't look at it from that perspective, but certainly we do in many developments provide more parking than required, which is a capital cost that ends up being passed on to the purchasers or the tenants of that building. So I certainly encourage moves towards the reduction in parking standards.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Is there any other questions for the delegation? Thank you, Mr. Jacobs, for your presentation. Mr. Cohen, if you'd like to bring your team up.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of committee. With me to my right, Brian Casagrande is the project planner, Barry Hoban, the project architect, and you may not know Tony DiBiase, who's an expert in student accommodations. I've been asked to appear this morning to make a couple of statements and then to throw it open to the experts to answer your questions. The first is to thank staff for the arduous effort that's independent of the results of the report, but rather the availability and energy, and to thank the ward councillor equally for the energy and interest, and to thank the community association. We don't see eye to eye with the result, but we're grateful for the opportunity to have met with them. I believe it was 5 or 6 occasions. We understand their concerns. We endorse the report, sir, and we commend it to you. We believe it provides the rationale and all the evidence necessary to support the propositions are in it and are available. You may have specific questions. That's why we've made our experts available to you, and I would invite those questions now.
I think that the issue, Ms. Casagrande, that you need to expand upon, and don't regurgitate the staff report. We've all read that. But if you have anything you could add to the policy, the requirement or the appropriateness of changing the policy framework under which currently operates to one that would allow you to allow this development to go forward, I think that would be of interest to the committee given the presentations that we've heard.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. The one thing I observed in hearing what I understood to be concerns from the community, and I believe Mr. Jacobs, that the amendment to the applicable secondary plan, the Sandy Hill secondary plan, was not evident in the staff report. I mean, I took it upon myself before, and certainly in hearing that, to look through the report with that lens specifically in mind. And I guess my observation on that is if you look at page 4 of the staff report where they go into discussion relative to the secondary plan, although they're not, and I would suggest that I haven't seen them typically do so otherwise, they're not going through it policy by policy, citing the secondary plan policy by policy, that is. Each of the statements in the paragraph in the middle of that page can be tied back to the secondary plan policies that are the high-level secondary plan policies that one might be able to look for. So I heard Mr. Jacobs say that, you know, this is a low-rise designation, therefore you shouldn't be providing anything other than low-rise. But the whole purpose and reason why you might entertain a secondary plan or an official plan amendment is to contemplate change relative to the higher level policies. So when you look at the higher level policies, I would suggest that the proposal complies with all of them, and the staff report has specifically been oriented to address each of them as you go through it. And then, of course, broader than that, it's done a fantastic job, in my view, of tying it back to the broader parent official plan and, of course, the policies that this committee hears about over and over again relative to the merits of intensification in locations that are appropriate to do so. And in my view, this site, as FOTEN's rationale has brought forward, is an appropriate site for that relative to proximity to the rapid transit system, relative to the context of buildings of similar scale and height, and relative to the fact that you're on a major collector road that has many characteristics of a main street, for that matter. So I think that staff's done a phenomenal job in their report, and you have all the policy references that you need to make the decision that's before you.
Councillor Bloss?
Mr. Casagrande, I got to ask you here, because I must admit, when I first read the report, I liked the proposal before us, but when I started listening to the delegations, and they certainly, I think, put more meat into it than what the report showed in terms of community concerns, and you sort of tried to give us the rationale, and I acknowledge you as probably being one of the masters of putting a rationale behind a proposal, but I'm looking at 2 excerpts out of the report, and one of them is where it says development, that although not necessarily the same or similar to existing buildings in the vicinity, nonetheless enhances an established community and coexist with existing development without causing undue adverse impact on surrounding properties. It fits well within the physical context and works well among those functions that surround it. And when I listened to the delegations, that certainly wasn't that's certainly not what their perception is, and I started to get my doubts. So I'm going to throw it back over to you. I know staff wrote this, but I mean, you're totally in agreement with what they're saying here. So try to make me understand how this actually is, how this is valid.
I think, through Mr. Chair, I mean, I guess from my perspective in looking at this application, it's important to understand that the context is not entirely low-rise. First of all, there's a real mix of development, and while many would like to dismiss the 9-story buildings and others that are higher in the area as anomalies, the reality to me is that they're there, and they've been there for many, many years, so they're now contributing to that reality. And I just look at the proposed development relative to the as-of-right zoning that can be put there, and I think Mr. Hoban's done a fantastic job of taking, there's a modest density increase that I understand is in the neighborhood of just under 25% in this project, but he's taken that density and the existing density and he's put it forward in a manner that's really complementary to the surrounding context. So when you walk down the street, your experience of this building is going to be one of a lower scale, and you're going to experience a sawtooth element to the design that has heritage characteristics in its design, active animation and uses at grade, and then as you move up the building, as it were, he's taken the care to articulate it and use even green elements on rooftops so that the mass of it really is broken up and it disappears would be an aggressive word, but it certainly doesn't have the overbearing feeling that it might have had, even in a 4-story element for that matter. So I think, in these contexts, it's so much about design, and the fact that this is still a mid-rise development, not a high-rise, a mid-rise in an area that has mid-rise even across the street needs to be really considered.
So you're starting to sound more like an architect than a planner now. So let me throw this over to Mr. Hoban for a second. He probably charges as much as an architect now. So Mr. Hoban, the additional rationale here, and I'm referring to the one slide that the one gentleman showed where he imposed the building, and it certainly doesn't look to me like it enhances, complements, or fits perfectly in there. So the rationale that staff has put in where they talk about section 2.5.1 is to enhance the sense of community by creating and maintaining spaces within their own distinct identity. The architecture proposed for this development ensures that the design creates a distinctive identity. So staff has given you sort of this complement in terms of what you're bringing forward. I just want to make sure that I understand this more than just the words that are there. How does this elaborate, please, on this, how the architecture here does what staff says it'll do?
I'm happy to respond to that. And I think that in terms of understanding the project, I think it's important actually to see this project in a broader context. This is exactly what Mr. Casagrande was talking about. If you look through the neighborhood, it's not a matter of an occasional variation in height. And what you, in fact, you see is the kind of history of development in terms of Sandy Hill. What you have is what we have at the corner of our property right there is an old historic house. Then it evolves to the 1930s in terms of low-rise apartment buildings. They're all pattern book buildings. And then during the 60s, many examples of 6 to 9 stories buildings that have been placed. I think when you look at the existing row of buildings that are there, and these are they're actually, a couple things that are important is that these buildings have basically been rammed in. None of them actually has any strong architectural merit on its own, and we commissioned Commonwealth Historic Resources to do a heritage impact statement. But when we started to design this, we looked at this corner building, which is
second in from the right at the bottom, and you can see it's been butchered, and you can't even see its original form. So the idea for us was, how do we make the public realm and the pedestrian experience the dominant experience? And for those of you who know, for instance, our project Westboro Station in Westboro, this issue of scale and stepping back is the most important thing. What happens at the streetscape is the most important thing. And so the reinvention of these buildings, as you can see from our rendering above, is about setting the scale. But in addition to that, it's actually paying attention to the streetscape. And one of the things that's important along the Laurier is that the sidewalk is detached from the street. So the street trees actually exist between the sidewalk and the street. There's nothing that's going to prohibit the retention of the street trees, which is an important part of giving scale. A second thing is that the pattern of these buildings, these buildings are economic pro formas when they were created. They're slammed in between each other. There's nothing graceful about the way this has happened in the past. But in the reimagining of form, you can see our building form has actually got these deep courtyards, which actually are intended to enhance the public realm. So not only are we respecting scale, the first 3 stories, materiality, which is reflective of what's there now, but we're actually reimagining the public spaces, which include the corner area which celebrates this existing house, the notion of being able to have social spaces around it, and then is creating a series of courtyards which organize the cadence of green space as you walk along the street. These don't exist today. Right now, you basically have these 1940s developer buildings slammed right up against the street, and if you look at what happens between the sidewalk and the street front, absolutely nothing. Basically, they mow the grass. They're not really in the public realm. What's really important is a sense of scale. And so when you look at, Councillor Blois, when you referred to the juxtaposition, yes, when you look at it in a pure elevation, you can see, hey, there's quite a big difference. But when you actually look at it in 3 dimensions, the whole impact is focused on the public realm and the experience of walking on the street. So yes, it's reinvented. You know, I listened to the various delegations. I think Judy Renford was very accurate in saying this is a really unusually large piece of land. And you yourselves, before this committee, have witnessed numerous proposals. This is an acre of land on a major street, what you would call a University High Street, connecting Sandy Hill to the university to downtown. And you know yourselves, you see, if you had an acre of land that's been proposed to you, no one would be talking about doing a 9-story building. They'd be talking about doing 12, 14, 16, 18 stories, very small, compact towers, very high, which had another impact. So the decision to go to a mid-rise form was to celebrate what happened at the lowest levels, the 3.5-story that forms the base, because it has a way of mitigating the impact of the 9-story building which is around it. And again, I'll go on about this, but you know, a good example of this is Westboro Station, where there's on Westboro Street, on Richmond Road in Westboro, where you can create a streetscape which very much reinforces the public realm, and the quality of the spaces and the cadence of the buildings are extremely important.
Just thank you for that commentary. Mr. Casagrande, I don't know if you want to comment on the parking. I'm going to be asking staff that question, and you can leave it up to them to answer, or if you want to comment in terms of how you think the reduced parking will work for the site. And you don't have to answer this. I count on them to answer, but if you want to give your comments, I will still be asking them as well.
I think I'd simply say that I agree with Mr. Jacobs and his response to that, Councillor Hume's response to it and his opinion, and the staff response. I think it's important that as we try and grow support for the infrastructure, the public transit infrastructure in the city, we start to look very closely at what is truly the need in each of these circumstances, with a little bit of a bent towards inconvenience of residents when we can get away with it relative to, you know, the functionality of development. So this is a site where I think that should be looked at. It's appropriate. And I think Mr. Holben, he told me something yesterday I didn't realize, that the, you know, underground parking facility is a bit flexible. So if they find that for whatever reason the demand is slightly higher, they could potentially put in some more spaces. But that's not considered appropriate in the circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for the delegation? Councillor Fleury? Not to the delegation? Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. So I'm going to close the public hearing portion of the meeting, and sorry, we've got, did you fill in a request to speak form, sir? Okay, you're not on my list, but if you'd like, we're going to let me dismiss these people. We'll invite you down, and that's the purpose of closing the public hearing portion. So. Okay. I know he's trying to speak. I'm trying to deal with that man up top who wants to speak. Let me get him sorted out. We'll get to Mr. Cohen to conclude, and then we'll bring back down the delegation. So.
So I'll speak
yeah.
up.
Yeah, why don't you go do that?
Thank you. I'm going to be brief. There are time constraints on this matter, and therefore I would appreciate it if committee would consider bringing this to the attention of council tomorrow.
And what are the time constraints?
We have to be able to open at a certain time of year, and we have a very tight timeline, sir, to be able to do that, to meet the right time of occupancy for students and the school year. It's a long program, sir. It's a tight.
Yeah, I know. It's just suspending. So we have to. What you're asking us to do is suspend the rules here, suspend the rules at council for which is really a major policy initiative. But anyway, okay.
Thank you.
You know, thank you for that, Councillor Fleury. We're going to have to take your guidance on this when we start to discuss this. So, sir, if you'd like to come down, and if you could state your, if you're going to, we'd like you to fill in a form so we can get your particulars for the public record.
I did, and I was on the list when I checked in this morning. My name is Martin Laplante. The 5-word version of my bio is Google evidence-based urban planning. I have a tip for newer members of this committee. Whenever staff start invoking the provincial policy statement for an ad hoc zoning change, you know that it's because the official plan disagrees with them. The PPS can appropriately be invoked when you're doing major reviews of the official plan, can be invoked for secondary plans or sometimes for comprehensive zoning. But for site-specific zoning applications, the PPS needs to be invoked only when the primary and secondary plans both fail to follow it or are silent on a major issue. And this is not the case here. As we've heard, secondary plan, Sandy Hill West secondary plan, go to an extreme level of detail, block by block, lot by lot, giving the appropriate location and character and scale for every single form of housing, every land use, every mode of transport. It's silent on nothing. So to be clear, it does implement the PPS. It does allow this type of housing form, simply not in that location. It's got 100 acres of opportunities for this housing form within a few blocks of there. I'd also like to make it clear that this is not a matter of people zoning. This is strictly a matter of zoning by use. And when it comes to determining, I was interested to hear that the one example of changes to that schedule as to what's allowed where is the one that was a result of a mistake by staff, of a failure to follow the secondary plan when using zoning. The PPS talks about having a range of housing type, a range and mix. Sandy Hill is one of the few areas in the cities that does provide the full range. When it comes to rooming houses, student housing, mid to high rises, you can point to just about any other community and say, your zoning doesn't provide opportunities for this, you don't have the full range. But anyone who says that Sandy Hill doesn't already have its fair share of these forms probably needs to get their meds adjusted. I've heard some people saying that the secondary plan is too old, maybe we should just ignore it, it needs to be restudied. But this isn't the case. The central part of Sandy Hill has spent 5 of the past 10 years under interim control bylaws being studied. It's under an interim control bylaw right now being studied for a very, very similar type of use. And there have been at least 10 studies in the past 15 years, of which 5 have resulted in systematic changes to the secondary plan. And from memory, I have the residential conversion study, the low-rise infill housing study, the Sandy Hill Heritage study, the rooming house study, the group housing study a few years back, the downtown urban design strategy had the Laurier Street strategy, the King Edward study that is very clear about university uses, the 2 different Rideau Street studies that we've had, and even the 2 Laurier East commercial studies in the late 90s that specifically address the issue of why there shouldn't be any commercial on that spot. So all of them have had similar conclusions, which is to say, to protect the current scale, the current character of this part of Laurier East, to put this type of housing elsewhere within the community. If this passes, you've got 10 different sets of city employees, authors of these studies, who can be subpoenaed to testify against the city. So there's no time to list all these recommendations and the way in which the recommendations tell you to maintain the scale. I'll just talk about a couple. The Heritage Study recommended a heritage overlay to freeze the building envelope here, okay, to protect their scale and their character. And I'm not quite sure why Council hasn't yet moved to do that, but that was the recommendation of staff. After the King Edward study a couple of years back, the University of Ottawa agreed on a change to the Sandy Hill plan to restrict university uses, such as this one, to King Edward and West. And the university is currently seeking proposals for building student housing on campus and off. And this area is the only part of the city that it specifically has designated as off-limits, that it has determined is inappropriate for this type of student residence. So if staff is telling you that the university is wrong, all 10 studies are wrong, the secondary plan is wrong, the official plan is wrong, delegations are wrong, and only staff is right, you have to seriously question whether they're giving you any value added on this. There's another argument I'd like to make, if there's time, about the 2014 PPS that's just come out about minimizing vehicle trips and increasing active transportation. This will actually do the opposite if you do the math. That is to say, you have to look at the people who would live there, and if those people were to live further away, would they be less likely to use active transportation or transit compared to other people who would live there otherwise? If you put them further away, would they be less likely? And the conclusion is there simply aren't that many locations where adults can walk to work and to retail, and the children can walk to school, and changing the zoning would eliminate one of those opportunities among the people who are the most likely to be using vehicles if they're living elsewhere. So, as you've heard, this is exactly the type of application urban planning was invented to present. I've never seen an application violate so many different tenets of the official plan. I recommend that you reject it.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation. Other questions for Mr. LaPlante? Nope. Thank you very much for your presentation. So now I'm going to close the public hearing portion of the meeting and turn the recommendations back to committee. And Councillor Blois, you had a question to staff with respect to the parking issue.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you for that. Just trying to understand the rationale, and I know parking is not a very precise calculation, I think, because we see that in our suburbs, we see that in buildings we're dealing with, I see it with nursing homes, where the formula we use doesn't always necessarily work out when the actual building is there. So I heard 2 things. I heard one of them, and we say that repeatedly, we don't zone for I think we don't zone for specific people, we zone for a use. And how do we then justify that we can reduce the parking significantly to accommodate what we think is a use but not a particular class of people?
Mr. Chairman, we actually reviewed the report to see where the delegation made the reference to reducing parking because it's students. It's not in our report. The basis for the recommendation to reduce the parking draws from the policies that Council has approved in its official plan that directs that we look to opportunities to reduce parking for properties that are well served by transit, that are in central locations, within walking distance to amenities and services. And in this instance, that in fact is what we have here. And in our view, a reduction in parking from the standard requirement is very appropriate at this location because it allows us to capitalize on those opportunities to get people to look at alternative travel modes. It wasn't tied to the fact that this was student accommodation. It was tied to the overall directions that provide for looking for those kinds of opportunities.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. The other point that was raised by one of the speakers was the timing of the traffic study in terms of being probably the quietest time in Sandy Hill.
Mr. Chairman, I can't really speak to the details on that one, but I do know in my experience when traffic studies are done, if they're done in periods that are outside of what people would tend to look at as the typical periods, there are adjustment factors that are applied to have them relevant to more typical conditions. So I don't know if that was the case here, but I know my experience is that that is a very common practice in the transportation engineering, transportation planning fields, but that's something that we can take a closer look at if there's a desire from the committee for us to do that.
Well, I think to maybe satisfy some of us and the delegations, and I think what I understand you saying is, regardless of the time that's used, there are adjustments made in the modeling to recognize whether it's the time period or the date or whatever. And I see nodding along. Is that what in fact is happening here?
Yes, that's in fact what's done. We also request the synchro files, which are the files that the model is based off from any applicant that comes in, so that our transportation engineer can review it based on our numbers. There's also a recent, there was student parking counts, student traffic counts, and there was a recent study done by our parking group in the area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for the questions? Okay, questions for the for staff? Okay. Councillor Fleury.
Yes, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I start relating to my comments about this proposal, I'd like to ask committee to not support the application, but also not support the change for timing. I think that as a community, we've demonstrated the importance of respecting process. We haven't talked about student-specific or behavior. Today we respected the planning arguments, and I think that should weigh heavy in terms of our community's respect to process. So I hope that committee will follow on that. Quelques éléments qui sont importants à considérer. Je pense que la communauté dans les dernières années, and I really hope that you'll allow me to bring it to maybe a behavioral level to allow to my rationale.
Councillor, it's your word. We're going to give you as much time as you need to help the committee wind its way through this decision.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, pour revenir à la composante, je pense que c'est intéressant que les gens qui sont venus, les membres de la communauté qui sont venus parler aujourd'hui opposant le projet, ont tous pas parlé de l'aspect qui est plutôt humain, qui est comportemental. Ces composantes-là sont un peu... il ne faut pas revenir... il faut à un moment donné être capable de résoudre ces enjeux-là. Mais vous savez, c'est tout l'aspect de l'augmentation de la population étudiante, puis certaines pressions sur les communautés qui sont près des campus étudiants. La communauté a été claire dans les dernières années. On souhaite que l'université bâtisse des résidences. On souhaite que l'université bâtisse des résidences sur le campus. Puis, même l'université, dans ses propres documents qui sont approuvés par leurs membres de gouverneur, mentionne l'importance d'avoir un endroit pour tous les étudiants de première année qui veulent habiter sur le campus, chose qui n'a pas été respectée depuis de nombreuses années. Je pense que c'est depuis la double cohorte que ça n'a pas été respecté. Alors, c'est important de savoir la source de l'enjeu. Je pense que notre communauté, récemment, les médias aiment peut-être jouer là-dessus, mais la communauté reçoit puis accepte les étudiants. C'est pas quand on parle aux résidents de la communauté, quand on cogne aux portes, quand on est à des rassemblements communautaires, on n'est pas contre les étudiants. Ce qui est mal compris, c'est qu'on essaie de maintenir une diversité. La diversité, c'est avoir des familles qui puissent habiter dans la Côte-de-Sable, avoir des personnes âgées, avoir différents types d'usages. C'est ce que la communauté revendique. On a vu famille après famille devoir vendre leurs propriétés, puis ces propriétés-là devenir des résidences simplement pour étudiants. Alors, ce n'est pas ciblé à un étudiant précis, c'est plutôt préciser ce qui arrive quand on met une intensité de combinaison. Alors, puis c'est sur cet enjeu-là où on a énormément discuté. Vous savez, on a fait du progrès au niveau des modifications au règlement contre le bruit. On a fait énormément de progrès au niveau des modifications pour les standards de ce qu'on s'attend autour des propriétés. On continue à essayer d'améliorer le processus de réponse au service 3.1, à service Ottawa et à tout. On voit du progrès au niveau comportemental. Mais là, ce qu'on voit aujourd'hui, and what we're seeing today is really something, a bit of a first, and we're seeing the extreme of the pressure from the university not building student housing on campus, student accommodations on campus. What you're seeing in the proposal is two elements that are interesting, is the private sector getting into publicly coming into or wanting an investment into the student housing. So there's definitely an interest on their part because it makes financial sense for them to do so. And the other element, it's the first time that we're seeing a proposal come in where the proponent says, I recognize I'm going to rent to students, and I'm going to make sure that the property is serviced 24/7. I'm mentioning that because I'm against the proposal. I recognize that what they're attempting to do is doing what the university should be doing on campus. And that is articulated in their proposal. They've talked about it in terms of when they present to the community and to us. And basically what we're seeing is really the institution that is the university not responding to their housing needs, which is what you're seeing in terms of pressure related to all the calls to 311 about noise and property standards, about all the conversion pressures that we're attempting to resolve, and today about a new application. A couple of the elements specific to a little more planning related. Some of the speakers earlier were speaking of the heritage importance of Sandy Hill. And when we talk about height and heritage, we have to recognize where the heritage is located in relation to this proposal. So on the left side of the image that you see on the screen, there is an adjacent heritage property. It's a 2 to 3 story building maximum. If you look south of the property, that's Sweetland. The property is adjacent to Sweetland and Laurier. All along Sweetland is one of the oldest heritage districts. And if you look at the properties there, once again, it's low-rise. It's 2 to 3 stories all along that corridor. So using the planning rationale that we read, that we hear from consultants, but also from our staff and from members of committee, is finding that transition zone to how do we address a 2-story to a 9-story. If that's approved, you lose that transition zone. You go from the 3-story adjacent to the 9-story. You have no transition zone, and I think that's something that's really worrisome. You've heard it through different elements related to the changes to our policy. Another element that was mentioned was that, look, there's already high-rises in the Laurier East portion quite close to that site. And there is quite older buildings that are higher than 6 stories along that corridor. But that said, that's when the secondary plan came in to stop some of these types of development and really protect the integrity of the neighborhood, the low-rise, stable neighborhood that Sandy Hill is. Alors, je trouve ça très difficile de voir ce type de proposition où on n'a pas de zone de transition. On a également, peut-être, on démystifie ou on simplifie ce qui est mentionné dans le plan secondaire pour dire c'était pas ça l'intention, regardez les hauteurs qui ont été permises. Je pense pas que c'est ça l'objectif. Je pense que le plan secondaire a été mis en place pour réellement protéger la communauté de la Côte-de-Sable. Vous le savez, c'est une communauté où, oui, il y a eu des gens au profil, oui, il y a des districts patrimoniaux qui sont d'importance significative pour la ville. Vous savez toutes les pressions universitaires qu'il y a sur la communauté. Alors, all this to finalize, I hope that community members will not support the recommendation, the staff recommendation, and at the same time, through my council colleague who's on the committee, Catherine Hobbs, I am bringing a motion forward that would hopefully be tabled at this meeting and gives us time until council, which would be from my recollection in a month, and we would then be able to find a funding source to actually start the review of the secondary plan. It's been clearly articulated by members of our community. It needs to be done, and it really puts our community at risk because this is an R4 zone. If we accept it here, there's no differences in the purely residential parts of Sandy Hill. So that committee accepts it or not today, our community is at risk of seeing this types of proposal on really residential street. So I would ask my colleague, I don't know in terms of process, Mr. Chair, if she can bring the motion up at this time.
Once you're finished speaking, she can introduce it, and she's just asking it to be, I'm assuming she's asking it, she's going to table it here and we'll forward it to council with whatever the recommendation from this committee is going to be, right, without a recommendation, and then you'd have to find a funding source and someone to, and I'll take Mr. Mark, if it comes, sorry? Sorry, I can't hear you.
If we're going to be sending something to council, it should have a recommendation on it. For, I mean, if there's no source of funding identified, we've had CDPs where the landowners have had to come together and provide their money. If the landowners of Sandy Hill want to pay for the CDP, let's go for it. But Councillor Bloss and I, more Councillor Bloss, struggled for years to get funding.
I guess what he's trying to do, what he's trying to do is signal tabling of table the motion. Goes to council without recommendation. He goes and looks for a funding source, which could be very similar to what you said. And at council, what would he have to do, Mr. Mark? He would have to have a mover and a seconder, would he not?
Mr. Chair, you could. It's extraordinary to be certain, but you could refer the motion to council. And then see if a funding source can be found between this date and the date of the council meeting in March.
And then if just referring it to council, does it have to have a mover and a seconder when it gets there?
If it's referred to council and there's no mover and seconder, it just dies. So you need a mover and seconder for it to proceed.
It signals an intent to do something if funding can be found. If not, he needs a seconder to... a mover and a second there to perfect the motion at council. So, okay? Okay, are you finished, Councillor?
I am.
Okay. So, Councillor Hobbs.
Just on this motion, I know the current zoning has been in place for a long time, and that is what is behind this, and I'll just read it because I don't see it up here on the screen. But whereas the secondary plan for Sandy Hill has not been reviewed since before amalgamation, its language defines the neighborhood as stable low-rise community, and whereas Planning Committee has determined that the goal as the official plan was to provide reliable zoning, and whereas reliable zoning in Sandy Hill, it's up now, is at risk for as long as the official plan, secondary plan, and zoning bylaw are not aligned, therefore be it resolved that the Planning Committee approve a review of the Sandy Hill secondary plan starting in Q4 of 2014 to ensure predictable, consistent zoning. So this is a motion to be tabled today for. It does not include a date by which time or discuss when funding would have to be secured. And
okay. Thank you. Are there any other, Councillor Blows, did you want to speak?
Just on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just maybe a quick question to Mr. Moser. Mr. Moser,
John.
I think this is probably a welcome motion to come forward, but I'm looking at the practicality of it. And I recall when we brought forward, and I think it was the previous term actually, when we initially brought forward trying to do a CDP for employment lands out in our area, and we even had the funding for it, and yet I think it's this year is when it's finally coming forward in the work plan. So in spite of a motion, in spite of funding and everything else, can you tell me how long it would actually, how long is it practical for this, or how practical is it for this to come forward in this time frame when we've had others sitting there waiting for resources to do them?
So just before Mr. Moser, and you're quite right, we have not changed we have not tried to fit in or jam the committee with things that weren't outside of our term of council priorities. That's why it's been suggested that he only table the motion here and go and find a funding source for the consulting resources required to do that. And if you can't, then the motion then would die, or it would become something we would consider at the next term of council priorities, because we've been fairly consistent with that approach. Now, Mr. Moser can tell you whether he can do it or not if Councillor Fleury was able to find a funding source from the resource perspective.
Chair, in terms of us being able to accomplish this in 2014, unless we're given resources to project manage and to hire consultants, we would not be able to do it in 2014, or even start it in 2014.
Yeah, okay.
So in order to do it, he needs the money. So, and that's why he's tabling it here, he's got a month then to find a funding source, and he puts that funding source and the motion before you at council when we consider this item, and you have the opportunity to say that's appropriate or not appropriate. So, Councillor Blais.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have to be honest, and I have to say some of the arguments made today at this committee over the last number of weeks and months relating to student housing have been appalling. The blatant ageism that is taking place is an insult, I think, to the diversity that exists in our city. If we're against this because students are going to live there, what stops us from being against something because old people are going to live there and we don't like the sound of ambulances? Or a certain ethnic group living there and we don't like the smell of their cooking? Or a certain linguistic group from living there and we don't like the sound of their music? We can't zone against people simply because we don't like their age demographic and they like to have parties, etc. If they're partying late and they're making noise, there are rules against that. Call the appropriate authority and have enforcement there. Simply saying that this shouldn't be student housing because they like to have parties or because they're young is an unacceptable justification or rationale. To say that it's the university's responsibility to provide all housing for all students from coast to coast who want to come to this university, our government is strapped for cash. And if I think what I would like them to invest in post-secondary, do I want them building student housing or do I want them to build the best center for research in health sciences or the best architecture building or the best arts program and facilities to accommodate those things. This is not where government money should be spent. The private sector is very capable of handling residential buildings, and that's where the focus should be from a government funding source. So the arguments presented today against this simply fall flat from any number of perspectives. It's a beautiful building. It embraces open concepts, livens up the street, and frankly will, I think, have a positive impact on the community rather than a negative one. And I would encourage members of the committee to support this. I'm indifferent whether it goes to committee tomorrow or next week or whenever. That has little impact for me personally.
Thank you, Councillor. Thanks, Councillor Blank. Councillor Harder, and then Councillor Hubley.
Oh, sorry, I thought that Councillor Hubley was first. I just have a question on the motion that Councillor Hobbs is bringing forward on behalf of Councillor Fleury. I wanted to ask Mr. Moser, where is Sandy Hill a rejuvenation or an update of the secondary plan? Where is that in the queue for plans of the city? Have we recognized it as a priority, and where is it in the status? Because we're talking about money and where that money is going to come from. Can we have a mic for Mr. Moser, please? There you go.
Mr. Chair, right now if you will, the renewal of a number of our old secondary plans. I mean, this isn't the only secondary plan that is, is 40 years old or more. Right now, to renew this plan is not on our term of council work plan. As I said before, for us to undertake this, we would have to be given the resources to do that.
How much would the resources be?
Well, we'd have to certainly hire a consultant to do the work. We'd have to hire some project management help. So, we're talking, probably $150,000, $200,000 to be able to accomplish that. So in terms of, that, if we're given the resources, we'd be able to accomplish that. In terms of all the other existing plans, I would think that is going to be a topic we're going to have to discuss in the next term of council work plan, because I think it indeed may be appropriate for us to go back and look at these, but I think we're going to have to do it in a strategic method. We're going to have to get council to endorse that over the next term of council.
So maybe this has just been a secondary plan that was forgotten as far as, or something didn't come up to trigger this discussion. But what I don't like about today is the fact that because of an application, we're having this discussion, and because of that, Councillor Fleury is going to go and try to shop the city budget to try and find the money, and we all know the rules on that. It has to come from our own area, unless you were, for example, pulling from a fund where it had been identified where there was a pressure to do it right now. So that concerns me a lot. And yet, for 40 years, we've had a secondary plan that has never caused us to make it a priority. And I guess another point is that, unlike most years, this is the last year of this term. So saying the next term and the priorities for the next term doesn't punt it off so far in the distance of another 4 or 5 years. And finding the money not going to be easy. I understand the reason why you're doing this, but I don't want personally to tie it in with this application. I don't want it to be because of this. I think that it's because it's finally time is the reason. But finding the money and having identified it as a priority to be at the top of the list, of a very stretched budget is, I don't think it's appropriate today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to say I agree with everything Councillor Blais has pointed out with this proposal. And one of the things that I was surprised by, the issue in the area is about a number of people trying to change over houses to add more rooms for students, which basically just become a house full of beds. Like we're hearing about dining rooms being converted into bedrooms and so on and so forth. And here somebody has taken the time and the effort and is willing to invest their resources into building something like this that I think maintains the character at the street level for the community, but also provides 100 plus extra beds, including fitness facilities, all those amenities, stores, coffee house, those kinds of things in there that are going to keep the students basically contained on that property a lot more than if we got into these houses with beds in every room. So I actually want to compliment the proposal and think that it is good. I understand the concerns with some of the pieces of it, but overall I'll be supporting this proposal and want to congratulate them on it. Thank you.
Councilor Minette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will also be supporting the proposal, but the one that I do have issues with is advancing it for tomorrow's council meeting. If there's a motion towards that effect, I'll be voting against it. I think that we have a process in place, and a 2-week period, I don't think it's devastating for to move forward. So if that is moving forward as a motion, I will be voting against it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Minette. Any other speakers? Okay. I hear, I think, what members of committee, what Councillor Fleury is trying to do. We have been very diligent in saying, you know, we're establishing term of council priorities, and we're not, you know, gerrymandering them in so that you can rely and the communities can rely on the predictability of things happening in their community, whether it's with CDPs in your area or other planning documents. And I understand that Councillor Fleury, however, has been very good at saying, listen, I don't want to jam the committee by putting this motion forward. I'd like it to be considered, which is his right, but he's also said, look, I want to signal that I'm doing this, I want to bring it forward, to lay it on the table, to advance it to council, because I realize that he has to go forward and find a funding source. And whether he can do that or not, I don't know. It's a tall task. He may be able to do it, and then we would be able to consider his request with the funding associated, where it comes from. Because I think where it comes from is going to be an important aspect of whether or not we should do that. And we've already seen in Councillor Fleury's neighborhood where we've had to take some extraordinary action with respect to conversions. We've had to do some extraordinary work, and I think it's worth allowing Councillor Fleury to see if he can find the resources in which to advance the work to renew this secondary plan. So, that being the case, I would say to members of committee, I don't see that this as being a significant threat to our work plan at this time, and I think it simply allows a member to see if he can legitimately place something before council with all of the elements in place. And in fact, he could come to council with a mover and a seconder and drop it on the table here. I think he's doing us, he's appreciating the fact that he shouldn't do that. He's signaling that this is his intent. Allow me to go off and find the funding. And if I can't, then it drops away. If I can, then it's legitimate for you to consider it, and he has between now and next council to do that. And I'll convey that I think that's the proper way to approach that, and I think we should give him that ability. So I'll allow him to table this, move the entire package forward to council on the understanding that he's going to have to find a mover and a seconder to add funding sources in here, and if he can't do that, it will drop away, and we will consider it in the next term of council's priorities at the time. And I will convey, I think, that some of the comments of members of council were very profound in framing some of this discussion. I have heard that, or I have read, we need a housing strategy, one size fits all, everything that should be covered. I quite frankly don't agree with that. Each university and college has its own unique housing situation. Whether it's the University of Ottawa on Sandy Hill, Carleton, the Glebe, Ryan Farm, Centrepoint, the Montreal Road community for Cité Collégiale, very different communities, very different types of housing. But there's no question that we need to be more, I want to say, more closely aligned with our educational facilities, and I'd hope that Mr. Mizzi and Mr. Moser and Ms. Snedden could take this at a bit of a direction that you guys need to get more integrated into that fabric, so that it's not only about their housing, it's about their development perspectives, and build a stronger relationship with our post-secondary schools so that we can work with them on housing, we can work with them on development issues, so that we have an ability not to tell them what to do, but to help them shape their development plans, both in student and other things. And I think that's because they are becoming large, directive, from a planning perspective, institutions, and it would bode us better to have stronger planning linkages to help guide their development. So, I mean, I know you're working on with the University of Ottawa on their accommodation strategy, but I think it has to be broader than that. I think it has to, we have to start to fundamentally understand these institutions, not only from their student populations, but from where their development is going as institutions, whether it's labs or engineering buildings or centers of excellence, to help them and help us achieve our joint goals. Because I think we need to strengthen these institutions so that we're all working together to find ways that we can accommodate development for these institutions, because they're part of building strong communities. They're part of building strong economies. And so I think it's important for us to strengthen those linkages and that fabric. And I think that we look at student housing, we look at housing, and we look at how housing changes. I'm not sure I would disagree with some of my colleagues that when you start to look at the street fabric in that area and how it's changed, what it was and what it used to be, that this isn't a bad change. It's not a bad evolution. So I will be supporting the staff recommendation, and I will also be recommending that we don't advance this to council tomorrow, that we allow it to follow the normal course. It's a controversial application, and it should follow our normal processes. I respect Mr. Cohen's request, but I would urge committee not to consider a motion to do that. I would also encourage committee to accept the tabling of the motion that Councillor Flory is asking you to consider, and to move that to council with the understanding that it would stay or fall depending on whether he couldn't find a funding source. So, and I would encourage you, Councillor, to speak to the mayor on those issues. So, anybody else? So if we can close off the hearing, and I'll turn us back to the staff recommendation and ask that we consider Councillor Fleury's tabling. Is that tabled? Table. Okay. Consider that. Now on the recommendations as they are before us? Carried with Councillor Shirelli dissenting. Okay. And is there a motion to move this to council tomorrow? No, there is not. Okay. Thank you very much. That item is concluded. Are there any notices of motions? Are there any inquiries? You do. Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My inquiry is, could staff please investigate and report on the potential savings if the city was to adopt a practice of purchasing stock plans for our recreational needs, such as skateboard parks and splash pads that require design plans, the goal of which would be to reuse these plans across the city when appropriate, as opposed to buying new plans for every project. I would ask that the report provide an estimate on how much we spend on such plans to provide a context for the potential savings for council. Thank you.
That's an inquiry. Perfect. We've got that inquiry. It may, Councillor, we may require, this may cross committee boundaries. It may have to come up through C whatever, Community Protective Services, but we'll get it into the system and we'll advise you on how the routing is going to occur. Okay, are there any other inquiries? No? Is there any other business? Okay, we are adjourned until March 25th.